In the sultry summer of 2013, the city of Jackson, Mississippi, was a place where tradition and faith intertwined. And nowhere was this more evident than in the Belhaven neighborhood. At the center of this community stood Pastor Samuel Bennett, a man who had spent over 2 decades cultivating his reputation as a beacon of morality and spiritual guidance. At 46 years old, Pastor Bennett was known for his powerful sermons that could move even the most hardened hearts. His church, Mount Zion Baptist, was more than a place of worship. It was a cornerstone of the community, drawing in hundreds of congregants every Sunday. Pastor Bennett's life appeared to be one of fulfillment. He lived in a stately home just a few blocks from the church with his wife, Grace, a woman of quiet strength and unwavering faith. Together, they had raised 2 children, now teenagers, who were the pride of the Bennett family. To his congregation, Samuel was more than a pastor. He was a symbol of what a godly man should be: disciplined, compassionate, and above reproach. Yet behind the closed doors of his study, Samuel Bennett wrestled with demons that few could imagine. The pressures of leadership, the weight of expectation, and the monotony of a life lived in the public eye had begun to wear on him. It was during this time of internal struggle that Jordan Mitchell entered his life. Jordan was a 23-year-old college student who had recently moved to Jackson to attend a nearby university. Handsome, charismatic, and full of life, Jordan was immediately noticed by many in the congregation, including Pastor Bennett. He started attending Mount Zion Baptist regularly, quickly becoming involved in various church activities. He was eager to learn, often staying after services to speak with Pastor Bennett about the day's sermon or seek advice on personal matters. What began as routine pastoral care soon evolved into something more. Samuel found himself drawn to Jordan in ways that he struggled to understand, let alone accept. Jordan, for his part, admired Samuel's wisdom and authority, but he also sensed something more beneath the pastor's carefully controlled exterior. Their meetings became more frequent, often extending late into the evening, long after the rest of the church had emptied. During these sessions, a bond formed that went beyond the usual pastor-parishioner relationship. Samuel began to confide in Jordan, sharing thoughts and feelings he had never expressed to anyone, not even his wife. Jordan, in turn, revealed his own struggles, his uncertainty about his future, his complicated relationships, and his deep need for acceptance. As the weeks passed, the nature of their relationship shifted imperceptibly, but undeniably. There were lingering touches, glances that lasted a moment too long, and a growing tension that neither could ignore. The lines between spiritual guidance and personal desire began to blur, and both men found themselves caught in a web of forbidden emotions. Pastor Bennett was acutely aware of the danger. He knew that what was developing between him and Jordan was not just morally wrong, but could also destroy everything he had worked so hard to build. Yet the allure of the forbidden was too powerful to resist. In Jordan, he saw a chance to escape the confines of his life, to experience a passion that had long been absent from his marriage. By the end of the summer, what had started as innocent mentorship had grown into a full-fledged emotional and physical affair. The 2 men met in secret, hiding their relationship from the prying eyes of the community and, most importantly, from Grace. Every meeting was fraught with tension and excitement, a dangerous dance on the edge of ruin. Pastor Bennett knew that he was playing with fire, but he convinced himself that he could control the situation, that he could have both his public life and his private desires. He didn't realize that the seeds of his downfall had already been sown, and that it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down around him. By the fall of 2013, the affair between Pastors Samuel Bennett and Jordan Mitchell had deepened into a dangerous and intoxicating secret. Their relationship, forged in the shadows, was a stark contrast to the pastor's public life, where he continued to present himself as a paragon of virtue. The thrill of the forbidden only heightened their passion, but it also magnified the risks they were taking. The affair was conducted with meticulous care, as both men understood the catastrophic consequences of discovery. They often met late at night in secluded spots around Jackson, Mississippi, places where they were unlikely to be recognized. One of their frequent rendezvous points was a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, where they would sit in Samuel's car, talking in hushed tones, their hands occasionally brushing, sending electric jolts through both of them. These moments were a blend of anxiety and desire, each encounter a calculated risk that both thrilled and terrified them. Samuel was acutely aware of the duplicity in his life. By day, he stood in the pulpit, delivering sermons on morality, faithfulness, and the dangers of temptation. By night, he succumbed to those very temptations, unable to resist the pull he felt towards Jordan. The contradiction gnawed at him, but the passion he felt in Jordan's presence was something he hadn't experienced in years. It was an escape from the pressures of his public life, a release from the expectations that had been placed upon him as a spiritual leader. Their affair wasn't just about physical attraction. It was a complex web of emotions. Samuel found in Jordan a confidant, someone with whom he could share his doubts and fears, someone who didn't see him as the untouchable figure he was to his congregation. Jordan, on the other hand, was drawn to the power and authority that Samuel embodied. Being involved with such a prominent figure made him feel important, even invincible. But as their relationship deepened, so did Jordan's feelings of resentment. He couldn't shake the sense that he was being used, that Samuel's interest in him was purely self-serving, a way for the pastor to satisfy his own desires while maintaining his carefully crafted image. Despite the growing tension, neither man was willing to end the affair. Samuel feared the emptiness that would return if he severed ties with Jordan, while Jordan enjoyed the status and influence that came with being close to such a powerful figure. Their meetings continued, each one more fraught with danger as the affair became harder to conceal. As winter approached, the pressure on Samuel began to mount. The weight of his double life was becoming unbearable, and the constant fear of exposure gnawed at him. He knew that if their secret were to come out, it would destroy not only his career, but his family and reputation as well. Yet the very thought of giving up Jordan was equally unbearable. The affair had become an addiction, a compulsion he couldn't shake, despite the risks. Jordan, too, felt the strain. The initial excitement of their relationship had begun to wear thin, replaced by a growing bitterness. He felt trapped in a situation where he held little power, dependent on the whims of a man who preached virtue by day and succumbed to vice by night. The imbalance of their relationship became more apparent with each passing day, and Jordan's resentment simmered just below the surface, threatening to erupt. Their secret affair was spiraling out of control, with both men aware that they were playing with fire. The line between love and manipulation blurred, and the stakes grew higher with each clandestine meeting. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Samuel and Jordan found themselves on the precipice of a disaster that neither of them could fully comprehend. The affair that had begun as a thrilling escape now loomed as a potential catastrophe, one that could bring their entire world crashing down around them. In early 2014, the carefully concealed affair between Pastor Samuel Bennett and Jordan Mitchell took a perilous turn when an anonymous tip arrived on the desk of Deacon Harold Thompson, one of the most trusted leaders at the Greater Faith Baptist Church. The note, typed and unsigned, was brief but damning. "Your pastor is not the man you think he is. He's involved in a relationship that will destroy this church if the truth comes out." Initially, Deacon Thompson dismissed the tip as a baseless rumor. Pastor Bennett had been a guiding force in the church for years, and the idea that he could be involved in something scandalous seemed preposterous. However, the unsettling nature of the accusation lingered in his mind, and Thompson, a man known for his meticulous nature, felt compelled to look into it further. Thompson began his investigation quietly, careful not to arouse suspicion. He started by reviewing phone records that he had discreetly obtained through a contact in the local phone company. What he found shocked him. There were numerous late-night calls between Pastor Bennett and a number registered to Jordan Mitchell, a young man who had recently joined the congregation. The frequency and timing of the calls raised red flags, as they often occurred well after midnight, long after any church-related business would have been conducted. Worried, but still not completely convinced, Thompson decided to dig deeper. He began to observe the pastor more closely, noting his comings and goings. Thompson's worst fears were soon confirmed. One evening, Thompson followed him unnoticed and was stunned to see the pastor meeting Jordan Mitchell in a secluded parking lot away from the church. Thompson's heart sank as he watched the two men embrace, their interactions far too intimate to be mistaken for anything innocent. He continued his surveillance over the following weeks, gathering more evidence, photographs of their secret meetings, records of hotel stays that corresponded with the pastor's unexplained absences, and testimonies from a few church members who had noticed Samuel and Jordan's suspicious behavior. The deacon's discovery sent shockwaves through him. As a man deeply committed to his faith and the well-being of his church, Thompson was torn between loyalty to his pastor and the undeniable truth of what he had uncovered. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on him, knowing that if the affair were exposed, it could bring the church to its knees, shattering the congregation's trust and potentially leading to a mass exodus of members. Thompson considered confronting Pastor Bennett directly, hoping to handle the matter discreetly and perhaps guide the pastor back to the path of righteousness. But as he wrestled with his conscience, the rumor mill within the church began to churn. Whispers of the pastor's inappropriate behavior started circulating among the church leaders, fueled by the subtle changes in Pastor Bennett's demeanor and the increasing distance between him and his wife, who had also begun to sense that something was amiss. The situation grew more precarious with each passing day. The deacon knew that he couldn't keep the truth hidden forever, but he also feared the repercussions of exposing such a scandal. The reputation of Greater Faith Baptist Church, built over decades, was now on the brink of collapse. As Thompson deliberated on his next move, the tension within the church community escalated, setting the stage for a confrontation that would soon shake the very foundations of their faith. By mid-2014, the once clandestine affair between Pastor Samuel Bennett and Jordan Mitchell had become a ticking time bomb, ready to explode at any moment. Jordan, increasingly frustrated and bitter, had grown tired of the secrecy. He felt abandoned by the pastor, who seemed more concerned with maintaining his public image than with the promises whispered during their most intimate moments. The power dynamics of their relationship shifted, with Jordan no longer content to remain in the shadows, invisible to the world. The tipping point came one evening when Jordan, after weeks of agonizing over his situation, made a fateful decision. He cornered Pastor Bennett after one of their late-night meetings in the outskirts of Jackson. Jordan's demeanor was different, no longer the hesitant young man seeking guidance, but someone hardened by betrayal. He laid out his ultimatum in no uncertain terms. Either the pastor publicly acknowledged their relationship, or he would expose everything himself. The threat of exposure sent a jolt of fear through Pastor Bennett. He had built his entire life on the foundation of his faith, his family, and his reputation within the community. The thought of losing it all, his wife, children, the church he had shepherded for years, was unbearable. Pastor Bennett tried to reason with Jordan, pleading for more time, for understanding. But Jordan's patience had worn thin, and his demand was clear. He wanted money, and he wanted it now. He named a sum that would cripple Bennett financially, but the pastor saw no other way out. Reluctantly, Pastor Bennett agreed to the blackmail, seeing it as the only way to protect his family and his position. The first payment was made a week later, a sum that drained a significant portion of the church's emergency funds. Jordan, however, was not satisfied. The initial thrill of having power over the pastor quickly faded, replaced by a growing resentment and a desire for more. More money, more control, more acknowledgement. The payments continued, each one deepening the chasm between the two men. What had once been a relationship driven by passion and secrecy had now devolved into a toxic exchange of power and control. Pastor Bennett, already under immense pressure, found himself increasingly cornered. The financial strain was overwhelming, and he was forced to make excuses for missing funds at the church, raising the suspicions of the church treasurer and the deacons. The situation spiraled further out of control as Jordan's demands grew more erratic. He began contacting Pastor Bennett at all hours, showing up unannounced at places where the pastor could least afford to be seen with him. The stress and fear began to take a visible toll on Samuel. He lost weight, his hair started to thin, and dark circles formed under his eyes. His once passionate sermons became disjointed and lifeless, filled with a vague sense of despair that his congregation couldn't quite understand but deeply felt. At home, the pastor's strained relationship with his wife worsened. She noticed the late nights, the unexplained absences, and the uncharacteristic withdrawals from their joint bank accounts. His children, once the light of his life, became distant as he struggled to maintain any semblance of normalcy. Meanwhile, the church community, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface, began to sense that something was wrong. Attendance at services started to dwindle, and the once vibrant atmosphere of the church turned somber and tense. Whispers among the congregation grew louder as people speculated about what could be troubling their once inspiring leader. Pastor Bennett, trapped by his own decisions, saw no way out. The blackmail had become a noose tightening around his neck, and the fear of public disgrace loomed larger each day. As the payments continued, the pastor realized that he could no longer control the situation he had created, and the weight of his choices threatened to crush him completely. By the fall of 2014, the blackmail had driven Pastor Samuel Bennett to the brink. Each passing day brought new waves of anxiety as Jordan Mitchell's demands grew more relentless, and the threat of exposure more imminent. Pastor Bennett, once a revered figure in Jackson, Mississippi, now lived in constant fear that his darkest secret would be revealed to the world. The pressure was suffocating, and the pastor found himself consumed by thoughts of how to escape the nightmare he had created. On the night of October 15, 2014, a violent storm rolled through Jackson, bringing heavy rain and lightning that seemed to mirror the turmoil in Samuel's mind. Desperation had taken hold of him, and he saw no way out but to silence Jordan permanently. The decision was not made lightly. It was the result of weeks of sleepless nights and frantic calculations. But as the rain pounded against the windows of his study, Pastor Bennett convinced himself that there was no other option. Jordan had become a threat too dangerous to leave unchecked. The two men arranged to meet in a remote area outside the city, far from the prying eyes of the community. It was a secluded spot on the edge of a wooded area, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that had been washed out by the storm. The pretense for the meeting was the final payment, a sum that Jordan believed would end their arrangement once and for all. But Pastor Bennett had a different plan in mind. As Jordan arrived at the meeting place, the atmosphere was tense. The rain had turned the dirt road into a slick, muddy path, and the wind howled through the trees, creating an eerie backdrop for the encounter. Pastor Bennett, soaked to the bone, waited by his car, his mind racing with the terrible act he was about to commit. The conversation between the two men was brief and filled with tension. Jordan, sensing that something was off, became agitated. He demanded the money, but Samuel hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached into his coat pocket. In that moment, something snapped. The fear, the anger, the shame, all the emotions that had been building up inside Samuel exploded in a single act of violence. In a frenzied panic, Pastor Bennett struck Jordan with a heavy metal object he had concealed in his coat. The blow was swift and brutal, catching Jordan off guard. He staggered back, but the force of the strike had been lethal. Jordan collapsed to the ground, his body lying still in the mud as the rain continued to pour down. The realization of what he had done hit Samuel like a freight train. He had killed Jordan. There was no turning back. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The only sound was the rain, pounding relentlessly on the earth, washing away the blood that had begun to pool around Jordan's body. Pastor Bennett stood frozen, staring down at the lifeless form of the man he had once been so infatuated with. The horror of his actions paralyzed him, but survival instincts soon kicked in. He knew he had to cover up the crime, erase any trace of their connection before it was too late. In the dead of night, with the storm as his only witness, Samuel dragged Jordan's body into the woods. The rain made the task both easier and more difficult. The ground was soft, but the mud made it nearly impossible to move quickly. Pastor Bennett worked frantically, his heart pounding in his chest as he dug a shallow grave beneath the roots of a large oak tree. He buried the body, hoping the rain would wash away any evidence of his crime. With trembling hands, he collected Jordan's belongings, including the phone that held damning evidence of their relationship. He wiped the device clean, erasing all traces of their communications, before smashing it with a rock and burying it alongside the body. The pastor then returned to his car, covered in mud and drenched from head to toe. His mind was a blur of panic and disbelief as he drove away from the scene, the storm still raging around him. But the act of covering up the murder was not enough to silence the guilt that now consumed him. The cracks in Pastor Bennett's carefully constructed facade began to show almost immediately. He returned home, trying to maintain his composure, but the weight of what he had done was unbearable. The guilt gnawed at him, haunting his every thought. He began to withdraw further, his once commanding presence at the pulpit now reduced to a shadow of its former self. The community noticed the change in their pastor, but no one could have guessed the true reason behind his decline. Samuel Bennett, once a man of God, was now a murderer, burdened by the knowledge that the truth would inevitably come to light. The storm that had raged outside on that fateful night was nothing compared to the storm now brewing inside him, threatening to destroy everything he had ever known. Jordan Mitchell's sudden disappearance on that stormy October night in 2014 did not go unnoticed. His family, alarmed by his lack of contact, reported him missing within days. Jordan had always been close with his mother, regularly checking in with her, even when he was out of town. When the calls and messages stopped abruptly, her concern quickly escalated into fear. The Jackson Police Department responded swiftly, initiating a missing person investigation that would soon unravel one of the most shocking scandals in the city's history. Detective Lisa Morgan was assigned to the case. A seasoned investigator with over 15 years on the force, she approached Jordan's disappearance with methodical precision. Her first step was to dig into Jordan's recent activities, his friendships, his work, and any potential relationships that might offer clues. It wasn't long before she discovered Jordan's involvement with Pastor Samuel Bennett. The connection between Jordan and the pastor was initially just a thread in the larger tapestry of the investigation, but it quickly became a focal point. Detective Morgan obtained Jordan's phone records, which revealed a series of text messages exchanged between him and Pastor Bennett. The messages, while carefully worded, hinted at a relationship far more personal than what one might expect between a pastor and a member of his congregation. The tone of the messages suggested intimacy, and the frequency of late-night exchanges raised red flags. As Detective Morgan delved deeper, she began interviewing members of the congregation, including those who had seen Jordan and the pastor together. Witnesses spoke of secretive meetings, hushed conversations, and a noticeable tension between the two men. One church deacon, who had been investigating on his own after receiving an anonymous tip, reluctantly shared what he knew with the detective. His findings, though incomplete, corroborated the growing suspicion that Pastor Bennett and Jordan Mitchell had been involved in a clandestine affair. The investigation took a critical turn when Detective Morgan traced a series of financial transactions from Pastor Bennett's personal accounts to an account in Jordan's name. The payments were substantial and irregular, coinciding with the time frame when the blackmail threats began. This financial link provided a concrete motive, suggesting that the pastor had been paying to keep their affair hidden. By November 2014, the mounting evidence pointed squarely at Pastor Bennett as the prime suspect in Jordan's disappearance. Detective Morgan knew she needed more than just circumstantial evidence to make an arrest, so she pushed harder, re-interviewing witnesses and scouring the pastor's digital footprint. In the course of her investigation, she uncovered more text messages, this time from a secondary phone that Jordan had used to communicate with the pastor. These messages were explicit, detailing not only their relationship, but also the growing tension as Jordan pressured Bennett for more money. The messages painted a picture of a man feeling trapped and desperate, and another man losing control of the situation. With the evidence in hand, Detective Morgan obtained a search warrant for the pastor's home and office. The search yielded more incriminating evidence, including a journal in which Pastor Bennett had written about his guilt and fear of losing everything. The entries, though vague, hinted at actions taken in desperation and spoke of a burden that was too heavy to bear. The arrest of Pastor Samuel Bennett on December 2, 2014, sent shockwaves through the community. News of his involvement in Jordan Mitchell's disappearance and the affair that preceded it dominated local headlines. The media swarmed the courthouse as Bennett was taken into custody, his face a mixture of resignation and fear. The community that had once revered him now found itself grappling with disbelief and betrayal. How could their spiritual leader, a man they had trusted with their souls, be capable of such deceit? The church, once a sanctuary, became the epicenter of a scandal that rocked Jackson to its core. As Pastor Bennett sat in a holding cell, awaiting the charges that would soon be brought against him, the full extent of his double life began to emerge. The evidence was damning, and the truth was undeniable. The man who had preached righteousness and virtue had been living a lie, one that had cost an innocent man his life. The investigation, though far from over, had laid bare the dark secrets that Pastor Bennett had fought so hard to conceal. Now, with the weight of the law pressing down on him, the pastor would have to face the consequences of his actions in a court of law, with the eyes of the entire community watching. The trial of Pastor Samuel Bennett began on February 16, 2015, in the Hinds County Courthouse in Jackson, Mississippi. The case had drawn national attention, with media outlets from across the country descending on the small southern city to cover the proceedings. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including members of Bennett's congregation, curious onlookers, and journalists eager to report every detail of the case. The trial was poised to be one of the most sensational in Mississippi's recent history, given the high-profile nature of the defendant and the shocking allegations against him. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Karen Jackson, presented a meticulously detailed case against Pastor Bennett. Jackson, known for her no-nonsense approach and sharp legal mind, outlined the evidence in her opening statement, describing the affair between Bennett and Jordan Mitchell as the catalyst for a chain of events that culminated in murder. The prosecution argued that Bennett, a man of God who was supposed to uphold moral integrity, had instead been living a double life, driven by lust, fear, and ultimately desperation. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors presented text messages between Bennett and Jordan, financial records showing the payments made to Jordan, and testimonies from church members who had noticed the secretive behavior. The most damning piece of evidence was a journal found in Bennett's office, where he had written about his fears of exposure and the lengths he would go to protect his reputation. The prosecution called a series of witnesses, including Jordan's family, who spoke of their anguish and the sudden change in Jordan's behavior after he became involved with Bennett. Key testimony came from Detective Lisa Morgan, the lead investigator in the case. She walked the jury through the timeline of events leading up to Jordan's disappearance, the discovery of the financial transactions, and the subsequent arrest of Pastor Bennett. Morgan's testimony was clear, concise, and left little doubt about Bennett's guilt. She recounted the night of the murder, piecing together how Bennett had lured Jordan to a remote location under the guise of a final payment, and then, in a fit of panic and fear, killed him to silence the threat. The defense, led by attorney Richard Malone, faced an uphill battle. Malone tried to portray Bennett as a man under extreme pressure, arguing that he acted in self-defense when Jordan became aggressive during their final meeting. However, the lack of evidence to support this claim made it difficult to convince the jury. The defense also attempted to discredit the prosecution's witnesses, but their efforts were largely unsuccessful. The testimonies of church members, who described Bennett's increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to the murder, only served to strengthen the prosecution's case. Throughout the trial, Bennett's demeanor was one of stoic resignation. He rarely made eye contact with the jury and spent much of the trial staring at the floor. His wife, seated behind him in the courtroom, was a constant presence, her face a mask of anguish as the sordid details of her husband's double life were laid bare for all to see. The once revered pastor, who had stood at the pulpit and preached about righteousness and virtue, was now exposed as a man who had succumbed to his darkest desires. The trial lasted for 3 weeks, and on March 10, 2015, the jury retired to deliberate. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense as everyone waited for the verdict. After only 5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. Pastor Samuel Bennett was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict was met with a collective gasp from the spectators, followed by silence as the weight of the decision sank in. Bennett showed little reaction as the verdict was read, his expression blank. However, his wife broke down in tears, her sobs echoing in the otherwise silent courtroom. The judge, recognizing the gravity of the crime, sentenced Bennett to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence ensured that the once revered pastor would spend the rest of his life behind bars, paying for the life he had taken and the trust he had shattered. The aftermath of the trial left the community reeling. The church that Bennett had led was fractured, with many members leaving in the wake of the scandal. The congregation was left to pick up the pieces, their faith in their leader, and in some cases their faith in God, deeply shaken. The story of Pastor Bennett became a cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how power, secrecy, and unchecked desire could lead to the most tragic of downfalls. As the media coverage subsided, and the courthouse returned to its usual routine, the legacy of the case lingered in Jackson. The once quiet southern city would never forget the trial that exposed the dark secrets of its most respected leader, forever changing the lives of those involved and casting a long shadow over the community.
In the spring of 2013, Pastor Michael Carter was at the height of his ministry. At 45 years old, he had spent nearly 2 decades building a congregation in Richmond, Virginia, where he was both respected and admired. His sermons were renowned for their depth, tackling difficult topics like forgiveness, redemption, and moral integrity. Congregants sought his guidance not only for spiritual matters but for personal ones as well. With his wife, Rachel, by his side and their 3 children growing up in a stable, loving home, Michael felt that his life was a testament to the power of faith and family. Anna Thompson had joined Pastor Carter's church earlier that year. At 22, she was a troubled young woman searching for answers. Life had not been kind to Anna. She carried the emotional scars of a tumultuous childhood, failed relationships, and a recent struggle with substance abuse. In Michael, she saw not just a spiritual leader but a source of comfort, someone who offered her stability and kindness when she needed it most. Unlike others who judged her, Pastor Carter treated her with the same compassion and understanding he offered all his parishioners. At first, Anna's admiration seemed innocent. She attended every Sunday service without fail, sitting in the front row, hanging on to every word of Michael's sermons. Her presence became a familiar part of the church routine, and Michael welcomed her enthusiasm as a sign of genuine spiritual hunger. After a few months, Anna began seeking more one-on-one counseling with the pastor. Michael, ever the dedicated shepherd, agreed, seeing her struggles as an opportunity to help guide a lost soul back to a better path. The private counseling sessions started simply. Anna shared her troubled past with Michael, her broken family, her loneliness, and her sense of unworthiness. Michael listened patiently, offering words of wisdom and advice rooted in Scripture. He encouraged her to find strength in God and reminded her that everyone, no matter how far they had strayed, was worthy of redemption. His words seemed to soothe her, and she thanked him profusely, her eyes filled with gratitude. However, as the weeks went by, Anna's behavior began to change. She grew more attached to Michael, always finding reasons to be near him after services or during church events. At first, Michael dismissed it as a harmless sign of someone seeking guidance. But then her admiration for him began to cross professional boundaries. She lingered after their counseling sessions, her compliments growing more personal and intimate. She often told him how much she admired his strength and leadership, how he was unlike any other man she had known. Michael sensed the shift, though he didn't want to acknowledge it at first. His instinct was to maintain his role as her counselor and continue guiding her spiritually, believing that her behavior would settle once she found her footing in her faith. He carefully navigated their conversations, always steering them back to matters of faith and avoiding any personal compliments or flirtations. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that Anna's admiration was turning into something more. One evening, after a particularly emotional counseling session, Anna made her first overt move. As they were preparing to leave his office, she touched his arm, letting her hand linger there longer than necessary. Her eyes held a longing that made Michael uncomfortable. "Pastor," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion, "I don't know what I'd do without you." Michael quickly pulled back, his heart racing. "Anna," he said, his tone firm but gentle, "I'm here to help you as your pastor, nothing more. Our relationship is one of spiritual guidance, and I want to make sure we keep it that way." Anna flushed with embarrassment, quickly apologizing. She stumbled through an explanation, claiming that she didn't mean to make him uncomfortable. Michael, ever the empathetic counselor, reassured her that it was okay but reiterated the importance of boundaries. He offered a quick prayer, hoping that this would be the end of the matter. But it wasn't. Anna's behavior only escalated. She began finding more excuses to be alone with him, offering to help with church tasks or volunteering for late-night events where she knew Michael would be present. During services, Michael noticed her eyes constantly on him, watching him intently from the front row. Rachel, his wife, started to sense the tension as well, though Michael downplayed it, insisting that Anna was just a troubled young woman seeking help. Despite his reassurances, Michael grew increasingly uneasy. He confided in Rachel that Anna was becoming more attached than he was comfortable with, but he didn't want to abandon her spiritually. He saw himself as her guide through a difficult time, and he didn't want to turn his back on her, believing that with the right approach, she could find her way. However, deep down, Michael knew that the situation was spiraling out of control. Anna's infatuation was no longer something he could dismiss as mere admiration. It had become a dangerous obsession. He prayed for wisdom, hoping that God would show him the right way to handle the situation without causing harm to Anna's fragile emotional state or to his own family's stability. As the summer months wore on, Michael found himself at a moral crossroads. He had always prided himself on his ability to navigate even the most complicated situations, but this felt different. It was personal, it was messy, and it threatened the very life he had worked so hard to build. Little did he know, Anna's feelings of rejection would soon turn into something far more dangerous. As the summer of 2013 progressed, Pastor Michael Carter began to notice troubling changes in Anna Thompson's behavior. Initially, her admiration for him had been subtle, attending services more frequently, lingering after church to ask for spiritual guidance, and expressing gratitude for his support during her struggles. However, over time, her actions became more overt, and Michael could no longer ignore the growing discomfort her presence caused him. Anna, once quiet and reserved, now made sure to sit in the front row at every service, often wearing revealing outfits that seemed inappropriate for church. She would arrive early, volunteer for every event, and make herself available to assist with church duties, all while focusing her attention on Michael. At first, he tried to see her actions as a sign of dedication to her newfound faith, but it quickly became apparent that her intentions were more personal. The boundary between spiritual guidance and inappropriate attraction had been crossed. Michael, deeply committed to his faith and his role as pastor, struggled with how to handle the situation. He rationalized Anna's behavior, telling himself that she was lost and searching for stability in her life. He believed it was his duty to help her, to steer her back on the right path, away from confusion or misplaced feelings. But the more she pushed for his attention, the more he began to realize that her intentions were far from innocent. He kept his distance, responding to her messages only when necessary, and always steering the conversation back to matters of faith. Despite his attempts to keep things professional, Anna's advances became more aggressive. She began texting him late at night, using spiritual advice as a pretense to ask personal questions about his life, his marriage, and his feelings. Michael grew increasingly uncomfortable but kept his responses polite and distant, fearing that if he pushed back too hard, it could escalate the situation. He also worried about gossip spreading through the congregation if anyone noticed Anna's behavior. His primary concern was his family and his reputation, which could be damaged by even the appearance of impropriety. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional Sunday service, things came to a head. Michael was tidying up his office when Anna entered, her expression troubled. She had been visibly shaken during the service, which Michael assumed was due to personal struggles she had mentioned in their previous sessions. However, the moment she stepped into the office, he sensed something different, an intensity in her demeanor that made him immediately uneasy. Anna began by thanking him for all the support he had provided, her words laced with an underlying tension. She praised him for being a guiding light in her life, saying that he had helped her more than anyone else ever had. As she spoke, she moved closer to him, her body language shifting from gratitude to something far more suggestive. When she reached out to touch his arm, Michael's heart raced with discomfort. The realization hit him like a wave: this wasn't just a conversation about faith. Anna had developed romantic feelings for him, and she was now making a move to act on those emotions. Panic set in as Michael quickly stepped back, creating physical distance between them. He firmly told her that their relationship was purely spiritual, rooted in his role as her pastor, and that anything beyond that was unacceptable. He reminded her of his commitment to his wife and his family, and to his responsibilities as a leader of the church. Anna's face twisted with a mixture of frustration and embarrassment. Her hopes had been dashed in an instant, and the vulnerability she had shown turned to anger. Without another word, she stormed out of the office, leaving Michael standing there, heart pounding and mind racing. He had never been in such a situation before. A member of his congregation had attempted to seduce him in his own office, in the house of God no less. For days after the incident, Michael struggled with how to process what had happened. He debated whether to tell Rachel, but ultimately decided against it, not wanting to burden her with the situation or cause unnecessary tension in their marriage. He believed he had handled the situation appropriately, firmly rejecting Anna while maintaining his professional distance. He prayed that Anna would come to her senses and understand the boundaries he had set. However, Michael couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that lingered in the pit of his stomach. Anna had been humiliated, and her emotional volatility made her unpredictable. He feared that her rejection could lead to unpredictable consequences, but he hoped, naively, that the situation would simply resolve itself. Unknown to him, Anna's embarrassment had already turned into something far darker. Her humiliation had festered into resentment, and she had begun plotting her revenge. If she couldn't have Pastor Carter's affection, she would destroy him, ensuring that his reputation, his career, and everything he held dear would come crashing down. By the time Michael realized the full extent of Anna's bitterness, the wheels of her revenge were already in motion, and the life he had carefully built was about to unravel. Anna's rejection by Pastor Carter was a blow to her pride that quickly turned into festering resentment. In her mind, the rejection was not only humiliating but also undeserved. Instead of accepting his clear boundaries, Anna's obsession with Michael deepened, warping her feelings into something dangerous. Determined to make him pay for rejecting her, she concocted a plan to destroy his life. One afternoon, filled with rage and a desire for revenge, Anna walked into the Richmond Police Department and made a shocking accusation. She claimed that Pastor Michael Carter had sexually assaulted her during one of their private counseling sessions. The details she provided were graphic and convincing, crafted carefully to seem believable. The authorities took her statement seriously, given the sensitive nature of the allegation. An investigation was immediately launched, and within hours, the news began to spread. By the next day, whispers of the accusation had begun circulating throughout the congregation. At first, disbelief echoed in the church community. How could Pastor Carter, a man of unwavering faith and moral integrity, be capable of such a vile act? But as the rumor mill churned, doubt crept into the minds of even his most loyal supporters. The media caught wind of the story, and soon, Pastor Carter's name and face were plastered on the evening news, linked to an alleged crime that horrified everyone who heard it. The police wasted no time. They arrived at Michael's home in the late evening, sirens cutting through the quiet suburban neighborhood. Rachel, Michael's wife, stood frozen in the doorway, watching in disbelief as the officers handcuffed her husband and led him to the waiting patrol car. Their 3 children, peeking out from the upstairs windows, were too young to fully understand what was happening, but the fear and confusion in their eyes were unmistakable. Michael, too, was in shock. As he sat in the back of the police car, his mind raced. How had it come to this? He had done nothing wrong, but now he was being treated like a criminal. He had always known that as a pastor, he had a responsibility to maintain professional boundaries, and he had taken that seriously. But none of that mattered now. Anna had spun her lies so well that it seemed no one was interested in hearing his side of the story. The investigation moved quickly. At the police station, Michael was questioned extensively about his interactions with Anna. Every counseling session was scrutinized, every text message and phone call examined. The detectives were stern and unyielding, treating him not as a suspect but as a guilty man. Despite his protests, the charges against him began to solidify. Back at the church, the congregation was in turmoil. Some refused to believe the accusations, standing by their pastor and offering support to Rachel and the children. But others, fearing for their own reputations or simply unsure of the truth, began to distance themselves. The once strong bond between Michael and his church community began to fracture. The media, ever hungry for scandal, painted Michael as a predator hiding behind the facade of faith. Sensationalized headlines screamed from every corner of the internet and television, and soon the case became a public spectacle. News vans camped outside the church and the Carter family's home, reporters eager for any new development. Rachel, heartbroken and overwhelmed, tried her best to shield their children from the worst of it, but there was only so much she could do. Despite the mounting pressure, Michael maintained his innocence. He knew that he had done nothing wrong, that Anna's accusations were baseless, born out of spite and rejection. But as the legal battle loomed ahead, he also knew that the road to clearing his name would be long and grueling. His faith, once a source of strength and comfort, was now being tested in ways he had never imagined. Rachel, though devastated, remained steadfast in her belief in her husband. She knew Michael better than anyone, and she refused to believe the monstrous claims being made against him. She worked tirelessly to support him, attending every legal meeting, every hearing, and standing by his side through the relentless media scrutiny. Their children, though confused and scared, found comfort in their parents' unity. In the weeks that followed, Michael's life became consumed by the case. His time was split between legal consultations and attempting to maintain some semblance of normalcy for his family. His church duties were put on indefinite hold, leaving a vacuum in the congregation that only deepened the sense of crisis. Every day felt like a new battle, and though Michael's resolve was strong, the weight of the false accusation was suffocating. Throughout it all, Anna remained eerily quiet. She no longer attended church, and there were whispers that she had moved out of town. Michael's legal team began digging into her past, looking for inconsistencies in her story, but nothing seemed to stick. The case dragged on, and with each passing day, it became harder for Michael to see a way out. The trial, when it finally came, would be the turning point, but as the accusation spread and his world crumbled around him, Michael Carter was left to face the darkest chapter of his life, not knowing whether the truth would ever be enough to set him free. As the trial began, Pastor Michael Carter sat in the courtroom, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. The year was 2014, and the once trusted leader of the Richmond Baptist Church now found himself the target of a vicious accusation. His heart pounded as the proceedings unfolded, knowing that his future, his family, and his faith were all on the line. Anna Thompson's fabricated story had become a weapon of destruction, and the media frenzies surrounding the case only added to the pressure. Anna took the stand, her face etched with a performance of vulnerability and fear. She spun a tale of betrayal and abuse, claiming that Michael had manipulated her during their counseling sessions, turning her admiration into a situation she couldn't escape. Her voice quivered as she recounted fabricated details, painting herself as the victim of a man she once trusted. Tears flowed, and her emotional testimony gripped the courtroom, tugging at the hearts of the jury. The prosecution leaned heavily on Anna's testimony, presenting it as irrefutable proof of Michael's guilt. They knew they had no physical evidence to back up the claims, but they believed that Anna's performance, paired with the shocking nature of the accusation, would be enough to convict Michael. The prosecution portrayed Michael as a man who had exploited his position of power, using his status as a pastor to hide his dark, predatory behavior. But beneath the surface, cracks began to appear in Anna's story. There were inconsistencies, small details that didn't align with the evidence. The timeline she described didn't quite fit, and the circumstances of the alleged assault seemed suspicious. Michael's defense team picked up on these contradictions, but they knew they were facing an uphill battle. Public perception was against them, and in cases like these, emotion often outweighed logic. Michael's defense team focused on his character. They presented him as a man of deep faith, a devoted husband and father who had led his congregation with integrity for years. Witnesses from the church, fellow pastors, and longtime friends testified to Michael's unblemished history. They described him as a man who had helped countless people through difficult times, offering guidance and support without ever crossing the line. Rachel, Michael's wife, was a pillar of strength throughout the trial. She sat in the courtroom every day, never wavering in her belief in her husband's innocence. Her support was unwavering, even as the media cast shadows of doubt over their family. Rachel testified in defense of Michael, speaking not only about his character but about their shared commitment to their faith and to their family. Her presence helped humanize Michael in the eyes of the jury, showing them that behind the pastor accused of such a heinous crime was a man who had spent his life dedicated to others. Michael's defense also highlighted the lack of any physical evidence. There were no medical reports, no witness accounts, no emails or text messages that could corroborate Anna's story. Everything was based on her word alone, and while her emotional testimony had been powerful, the defense argued that it wasn't enough to convict a man who had spent his life upholding the values of truth and justice. As the trial stretched on, the emotional toll weighed heavily on Michael. He prayed daily for strength, leaning on his faith in God to carry him through the darkest days. He felt the stares of the courtroom on him, the skepticism in the eyes of the jury, and the judgment from the media, but he never wavered in his belief that the truth would come to light. Despite the overwhelming pressure, Michael maintained his composure, knowing that he could only rely on the truth and his faith in God's will. The courtroom became a battleground, with Michael's character being questioned at every turn. The prosecution painted him as a manipulative predator, while the defense sought to show him as a man who had been caught in a web of lies spun by a troubled young woman. Michael could feel the tension mounting with each day of the trial, the weight of the accusation pressing down on him like a heavy burden he could barely carry. For Michael, every day in court was an excruciating test of patience and endurance. He watched as the prosecution tried to chip away at his reputation, using every possible angle to cast doubt on his innocence. But he also watched as his legal team steadily chipped away at Anna's credibility. They pointed out the contradictions in her story, the lack of corroborating evidence, and the fact that Anna's own life had been filled with chaos and personal issues before she ever met Michael. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides made their closing arguments. The prosecution emphasized the emotional impact of Anna's testimony, urging the jury to believe her story and convict Michael of the crime. They warned that a man like him, with so much influence, could easily escape justice unless the jury held him accountable. The defense, on the other hand, made a passionate plea for the truth. They pointed out the holes in Anna's story, the lack of physical evidence, and Michael's long history of service to his community. They reminded the jury that the law required proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and in this case, that proof simply didn't exist. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, Michael sat quietly with his hands clasped in prayer, his heart pounding in his chest. The days of waiting felt like an eternity, but he remained hopeful, believing that God would guide the jurors to see the truth. For Michael and his family, the trial had become more than just a legal battle. It was a test of their faith, their resilience, and their commitment to one another. Through every painful moment, they had clung to the belief that the truth would prevail, and that God's will would ultimately determine their fate. The verdict was now in the hands of the jury, and all Michael could do was wait, praying that justice would be served and that the truth would finally set him free. As the trial moved forward, doubts about Anna Thompson's accusations against Pastor Michael Carter began to emerge. On the surface, Anna had appeared vulnerable and believable, but as more witnesses were called to the stand, the foundation of her story began to crumble. Church members who had interacted with Anna in the months leading up to the alleged assault described her increasingly erratic behavior. Several noted how she had fixated on Pastor Carter, becoming unusually possessive and often displaying signs of jealousy whenever he interacted with other female congregants. It wasn't just the congregation who started to question her motives. Detective Robert Miller, who had initially taken Anna's accusations at face value, began to notice discrepancies in her statements. Miller had a reputation for being thorough, and something about this case didn't sit right with him. The more he investigated, the more he found inconsistencies between Anna's version of events and the evidence they had collected. Miller requested a deeper dive into Anna's background. What he found raised serious concerns. Anna had a documented history of making false claims of abuse, particularly against men in positions of authority. In one instance, several years earlier, she had accused a former employer of harassment, a case that was eventually dismissed due to lack of evidence and conflicting testimony from her own friends. Miller presented these findings to the prosecution, but they were reluctant to abandon the case based on Anna's past. They had already staked so much on her testimony, and the pressure from the media was mounting. However, the turning point came when Pastor Carter's defense team introduced phone records that cast serious doubt on Anna's timeline of events. These records showed that Anna had sent numerous text messages to Pastor Carter in the days leading up to the alleged assault, messages that were anything but fearful. The texts revealed that Anna had been pursuing Pastor Carter aggressively, with some messages expressing frustration and anger over his rejection of her advances. One text in particular caught everyone's attention. Sent just days before she reported the assault, Anna had written, "I can't believe you're choosing her over me. You'll regret this." The text was a clear indication of Anna's motivations. She had been furious that Pastor Carter had remained loyal to his wife, and she was determined to punish him for rejecting her. This message directly contradicted her previous testimony, in which she had claimed that she had been fearful of the pastor for weeks prior to the incident. During cross-examination, the defense attorney methodically tore apart Anna's story, using her own words against her. Under the pressure, Anna's confident demeanor faltered. She stammered, her answers becoming evasive as the defense attorney pointed out the inconsistencies between her testimony and the physical evidence. The congregation, once divided over the case, began to see the truth. Anna had fabricated the accusation out of spite. Detective Miller, now fully convinced of Pastor Carter's innocence, presented his findings to the court. He outlined Anna's manipulative history, showing that this was not the first time she had used false accusations as a weapon. The courtroom was filled with murmurs as Miller detailed his investigation, revealing how Anna had carefully constructed her lies in a fit of revenge. By the time Miller finished his testimony, it was clear to everyone in the room that the prosecution's case had fallen apart. Anna's story had been exposed as a web of lies, and her motivations for accusing Pastor Carter were laid bare. Even the prosecutor, who had initially been confident in Anna's story, struggled to regain control of the narrative. As the jury listened to the final arguments, the mood in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What had once seemed like a straightforward case of abuse had transformed into a complex story of deception and malice. The evidence was overwhelming. Anna had tried to ruin an innocent man's life because she couldn't accept his rejection. For Pastor Carter, the trial had been an ordeal that tested not only his faith but his resolve to stay true to himself. He had never doubted his innocence, but the weight of the accusation had been unbearable. As he sat in the courtroom, listening to the truth finally come to light, he felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It was as though a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The tide had turned in Pastor Carter's favor, but the damage to his reputation and his family had been severe. Throughout the trial, his wife Rachel had stood by his side, steadfast in her belief in his innocence. She had weathered the storm of public scrutiny with grace and strength, knowing in her heart that the man she loved would never commit the crime he was accused of. The media, once eager to sensationalize the accusations against Pastor Carter, now shifted their focus to the uncovering of Anna's deceit. The trial had become not just a legal battle but a test of the power of truth in the face of falsehood. For many in the community, it was a sobering reminder of how easily lives could be destroyed by lies. By the time the defense rested its case, the courtroom had grown quiet. The jury, now fully aware of the depths of Anna's deception, prepared to deliberate on the case. Pastor Carter, having endured months of uncertainty and humiliation, waited patiently for the verdict, trusting that the truth would set him free. His faith in God and in the justice system had been tested to its limits, but he knew that divine intervention had guided the trial to this point. In that moment, as he sat beside his wife and family, Pastor Carter prayed not just for justice, but for the strength to forgive. The final day of the trial arrived in early November 2013, and the courtroom was thick with tension. Pastor Michael Carter sat beside his lawyer, his heart pounding, as the jury filed back into the room after hours of deliberation. His wife, Rachel, and their children sat in the gallery, clutching each other's hands, anxiously awaiting the verdict that would either clear his name or condemn him. Michael had spent months trapped in a nightmare, falsely accused of a crime he had not committed, his reputation shattered, and his faith tested to its limits. The accusations from Anna Thompson had shaken him to his core, but his faith in God had remained steadfast. Now, as the jury prepared to deliver its decision, he could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. The lead juror stood, the verdict in hand. As the foreman began to speak, time seemed to slow for Michael. On the charge of sexual assault, we, the jury, find the defendant, Pastor Michael Carter, not guilty. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the courtroom, and for a brief moment, Michael felt as though he could breathe again. Rachel broke into quiet sobs of joy, clinging to her children as they cried with her. Michael closed his eyes, silently thanking God for seeing him through the darkest trial of his life. The truth had finally come to light, and justice had been served. However, the emotional toll of the ordeal was undeniable. Michael had been vindicated in the eyes of the law, but the damage to his reputation lingered. As he left the courthouse, flanked by his family and a few close friends, he was acutely aware of the stares from the press, the cameras flashing, the murmurs from onlookers. The congregation, once divided over the accusations, had slowly begun to rally around him, but there were still those who harbored doubts. It would take time for the wounds to heal. In the weeks that followed, Michael returned to the pulpit, though the weight of the scandal still loomed over him. His sermons took on a new depth, shaped by the pain and suffering he had endured. He spoke of faith, of resilience, and of forgiveness, knowing that his own journey had tested his beliefs in profound ways. The congregation, having witnessed the trial and the ordeal he had been through, began to see him not just as their pastor, but as a man who had lived through fire and emerged stronger. Anna Thompson, who had once been a fixture in the church, was charged with perjury and making false accusations. The truth of her lies had come to light during the trial, and she had been unable to maintain the charade under the pressure of cross-examination. Disgraced and ostracized, she left town shortly after her conviction, her life in ruins. It was a tragic end for a young woman who had allowed her emotions to spiral out of control, but Michael, ever the man of faith, prayed for her, hoping that one day she too would find redemption. For Michael, the scars from the experience would remain for a long time. The strain on his family had been immense, and though Rachel had never wavered in her belief in his innocence, the stress had taken its toll on their marriage. There were moments when they had both wondered if they could survive the pressure, but in the end, the trial had brought them closer together. Their bond had been tested, but it had emerged stronger, a testament to their shared faith and commitment to one another. The congregation, now united in support of Michael, reached out to offer their apologies for having doubted him. Church members who had once whispered behind his back now came forward, expressing their remorse and their gratitude for his strength in the face of adversity. It wasn't easy for Michael to forgive those who had turned against him, but his faith guided him toward compassion, and he welcomed their words with grace. As the months passed, life began to return to a new kind of normal. Michael continued to serve his community, his sermons now imbued with the hard-won wisdom of a man who had faced the brink of destruction and come out the other side. He used his story as a reminder to his congregation of the power of truth, faith, and perseverance. He spoke of forgiveness, not just of others, but of oneself, and the importance of trusting in God, even when the path seemed darkest. Though the scars from the experience would always remain, Michael no longer saw them as marks of pain. Instead, they were symbols of survival, of faith tested and strengthened. His life had been irrevocably changed, but he knew that he had been guided by something greater. The truth had prevailed, and Michael had found a new sense of purpose in sharing his story. The small community of Richmond, Virginia, had been rocked by the scandal, but now, as the dust settled, there was a sense of healing. Pastor Michael Carter had been vindicated, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the hearts of those who had once doubted him. And as he looked out over his congregation one Sunday morning, his family seated proudly in the front row, Michael knew that this chapter of his life, though painful, had brought him closer to the truth of his faith. The ordeal had tested him in ways he could never have imagined, but he had come out the other side, stronger and more committed than ever to his calling.
In 2013, Rachel Turner's life was a fragile balancing act. At 34, she had already faced more hardship than most. Raised in a small town near Montgomery, Alabama, she fell into the wrong crowd in her early 20s, which led to a spiral of drug use and petty theft. Her criminal record included multiple charges, the worst of which saw her serve time for drug possession. That experience had deeply scarred her, but it also pushed her to change. She knew she had to clean up her life, not just for herself, but for her two children, 14-year-old Lily and 9-year-old Max. The road to redemption was difficult. After serving time in jail and completing rehabilitation, Rachel returned to Montgomery, determined to create a stable home for her children. Her husband, Greg, worked tirelessly as a mechanic at a local garage. The long hours and the physical toll of his job meant that he was often absent, leaving Rachel to handle the day-to-day responsibilities of raising their children and managing their modest home. The pressure of rebuilding her life weighed heavily on her, but she was resolute. Rachel's past made it hard for her to find work. Many potential employers saw her criminal record as a red flag, and doors continued to close in her face. To cope, she sought out community support, and that's when she found the local Baptist church. It was a small but tight-knit congregation led by Pastor Jonathan Reed, a charismatic man in his early 50s. He was a figure of authority in Montgomery, known for his fiery sermons, community outreach, and work with troubled families. He presented himself as a shepherd of lost souls, and to Rachel, it seemed like the perfect place to find spiritual healing and redemption. At first, the church felt like a haven for Rachel. Pastor Reed welcomed her warmly, offering her private counseling sessions where he emphasized forgiveness and the opportunity for a fresh start. He spoke with authority, but also a gentleness that Rachel desperately needed. The church became a safe place for her, a retreat from the harsh realities of her life, and Pastor Reed became a mentor she looked up to. He knew about her past, but instead of judgment, he offered what appeared to be unconditional support. For the first time in years, Rachel felt like she was on the right path. She became deeply involved in the church, volunteering for events and attending every Sunday service with her children. Lily and Max also started attending the church's youth programs, which gave Rachel some much-needed time to herself. As Rachel's involvement in the church deepened, so did Pastor Reed's hold over her. At first, his attention seemed benign, even helpful. He had always been a charismatic and authoritative figure in the church, and for Rachel, still seeking redemption and forgiveness for her past, his guidance felt essential. Reed regularly offered her private counseling sessions, framing them as spiritual mentorship. Rachel, still fragile from her journey out of addiction and legal troubles, believed that he was invested in her personal growth and recovery. However, beneath Reed's facade of compassion lurked something far darker. Over time, his behavior became more controlling. He asked increasingly invasive questions about her past, subtly prying into details about her criminal record, her struggles with addiction, and her relationships with her husband and children. Rachel, eager to rebuild her life, shared more than she probably should have, trusting Reed's promise of discretion. But what she didn't realize was that Reed was storing every piece of information like a weapon, waiting for the right moment to use it against her. It was after a church fundraiser one evening when the dynamics shifted irrevocably. As the rest of the congregation trickled out, Reed asked Rachel to stay behind and help clean up. She didn't think anything of it at first. It wasn't unusual for Reed to ask her for help with church duties. But once they were alone in his office, the atmosphere changed. Reed's tone became colder, more calculated. He began to talk about her criminal record, bringing up details she had shared with him in confidence. At first, his comments seemed offhand, but as he continued, it became clear that he was holding her past over her head. "You've come a long way," he said, leaning against his desk, his eyes dark and predatory. "But you know, it wouldn't take much for everything to fall apart again. People in this town, they're quick to judge. The law, too. If the wrong people knew about your past, it could make things complicated." Rachel's heart raced as his meaning became clear. She felt a sickening sense of dread creep over her. Reed wasn't just reminding her of her past, he was threatening her. She tried to stand her ground, reminding him that she had paid for her mistakes, that she was working hard to be a better mother, a better person. But Reed's expression never wavered. He began to hint at his connections, people in law enforcement, other community leaders, people who could make life difficult for her again. He painted a picture of how easily her life could spiral back into chaos. And then he delivered his ultimatum. "If you want to protect your family, you'll do what I ask," he said, his voice low and cold. Rachel was trapped. She knew that Reed's influence in the community was powerful. If he wanted to ruin her life, he could, and she couldn't risk it. The thought of losing her children, of going back to jail, terrified her. Reed's demand was sickeningly clear. He wanted her in a sexual relationship, and he would use her fear of exposure and her vulnerability as leverage. In that moment, Rachel realized she had no one to turn to. She couldn't tell her husband, Greg. He would never understand, and even if he did, what could he do against a man like Pastor Reed? The church had become her lifeline, and now it was her prison. That night, Rachel made the gut-wrenching decision to comply with Reed's demands, believing she had no other choice. Over the following weeks, their secret affair began in the shadows of the church. Reed controlled every aspect of their encounters, where they met, how they communicated, when it would happen. He isolated Rachel, ensuring that she would be too afraid to speak out, too trapped by the threat of exposure to escape. The guilt Rachel felt was unbearable. She couldn't look her husband in the eye anymore. The weight of her secret made it impossible to find peace, even in her own home. Every time she was with Reed, she felt disgusted with herself, but the fear of what he might do kept her silent. She tried to put on a brave face for Lily and Max, but the strain began to show. Reed, sensing her internal struggle, only tightened his grip. He reminded her constantly of the consequences if she didn't keep quiet, if she didn't follow his demands. The once charismatic pastor who had offered her redemption had now become her tormentor. For Rachel, every day became a waking nightmare. She was living a double life, one where she was a devoted mother and wife trying to rebuild her family, and another where she was trapped in a web of coercion and manipulation by the very man she had trusted to help her. Pastor Reed's dark demands were only the beginning of a twisted game of control, and Rachel, suffocated by fear, felt like there was no escape. As the weeks stretched into months, Rachel found herself further entangled in the twisted relationship with Pastor Reed. His power over her was absolute, built on the foundation of fear and manipulation. Every day, Rachel was reminded of how fragile her life had become, living under the constant threat that her past would be exposed, and her family torn apart if she didn't comply with Reed's demands. Despite her attempts to compartmentalize the shame and guilt, the pressure was suffocating, consuming every part of her life. Reed, growing more confident in his control, began to push the boundaries of their secret meetings. No longer content with the privacy of their previous encounters, he started demanding to see her at riskier times and locations. He'd call her late at night, insisting she meet him at the church, or even in places where they risked being seen by other members of the congregation. The fear of discovery loomed over Rachel like a dark cloud, but she felt powerless to resist. Each time she tried to distance herself, Reed's threats would pull her back in, reminding her of how quickly her life could unravel. At home, Rachel's mental and emotional state deteriorated. She struggled to function as a mother and wife, haunted by the secrets she carried. Her husband, Greg, began to notice the changes in her. She was more distant, frequently distracted, and prone to sudden emotional outbursts. He would often ask if something was wrong, his concern genuine, but Rachel, terrified of the truth coming out, lied to him. She blamed the stress of their financial situation, her difficulty finding work, and the challenges of raising their children, especially Lily, who had begun exhibiting typical teenage rebellion. Greg accepted her excuses, but his patience was wearing thin. Despite her efforts to keep the darkness from touching her children, Rachel's relationship with them also began to suffer. Lily, in particular, felt the distance between her and her mother. The once close bond they had shared was now strained by Rachel's emotional absence. Max, younger and less aware of the tension, still sensed the change in the atmosphere at home. The household was no longer a place of comfort and stability, but rather a fragile structure held together by Rachel's silence. Then came the day that changed everything. Rachel arrived at the church for one of her scheduled meetings with Reed, dreading what had become an unbearable routine. She had grown used to the pattern of Reed's manipulation, his control over her life and body, but she wasn't prepared for what he would ask next. In his office, Reed's demeanor was different, more assertive, more predatory. After a few moments of small talk meant to further disarm Rachel, Reed made his demand. He no longer wanted just her compliance, he wanted more. With a chilling calmness, he suggested that it was time for Rachel to bring her daughter Lily to him. He framed the demand as though he were doing Rachel and her family a favor, implying that Lily could benefit from the same guidance he had provided Rachel. The insinuation was clear, and it horrified Rachel to her core. Her heart pounded in her chest as the full weight of what Reed was asking crashed over her. For a moment, she was paralyzed by fear and disbelief. She had endured the degradation and control for months, believing that if she complied, she could protect her family. But now Reed had crossed a line that shattered any remaining illusion of control. This wasn't just about her anymore. He was threatening to involve her innocent daughter. In a rare moment of defiance, Rachel refused. She told Reed there was no way she would ever involve Lily, but Reed, as always, had the upper hand. He reminded Rachel of the consequences of defiance, the destruction of her family, the loss of her children, her past crimes laid bare for the world to see. He painted a terrifying picture of what life would look like if she didn't comply. Reed's threats were no longer just about Rachel's future, but Lily's as well. Rachel left the church that day in a state of shock, her mind racing as she replayed Reed's words over and over again. She had never felt more trapped, more powerless. The shame of the affair had been unbearable, but the idea of involving her daughter in Reed's twisted games filled her with a rage she had never known before. She had been willing to sacrifice herself to protect her family, but now the stakes had been raised beyond anything she could have imagined. The emotional toll of keeping Reed's secret had already pushed Rachel to her limits, but now faced with the impossible choice of protecting her daughter or submitting to Reed's demands once again, Rachel found herself on the edge of a breakdown. She knew she couldn't continue living like this, but she couldn't see a way out. Every avenue seemed blocked, and Reed's control seemed insurmountable. Rachel's refusal to comply with Pastor Reed's grotesque demand sent her spiraling into a psychological nightmare. Fear for her daughter Lily consumed her every waking moment. She knew Reed was relentless, and her imagination ran wild with terrifying scenarios in which Reed found a way to manipulate or coerce her daughter without Rachel being able to stop it. Her life, once a fragile balance of secrecy and shame, was now ruled by paranoia and dread. The constant stress began to wear Rachel down physically and emotionally. She lost weight, barely ate, and found herself staying up late into the night, obsessively checking on Lily. Every time the phone rang or a car passed by, Rachel's heart pounded with fear that Reed was one step closer to carrying out his threat. She monitored Lily's movements, becoming overprotective in ways that confused and frustrated her daughter. Lily, who had no idea what was happening, grew distant from her mother, confused by Rachel's sudden overbearing nature. Greg, unaware of the dark undercurrents consuming his wife, noticed the dramatic change in Rachel's behavior. She was distant, her moods unpredictable, and she often seemed distracted during their rare family dinners. Greg asked Rachel what was wrong, but every time she brushed him off with vague explanations about stress or her struggle to find a job. The mounting tension in their home became palpable. Greg, though concerned, was working longer hours to support the family and believed that whatever was troubling Rachel would pass in time. But Rachel knew otherwise. Her world was falling apart, and she couldn't confide in anyone. Reed's threats held her hostage, paralyzing her with the fear of losing her children and her freedom. The shame of the affair weighed heavily on her conscience, making her feel guilty for betraying Greg, even though she had been coerced into it. The thought of Greg discovering the truth was almost as unbearable as the thought of Reed hurting Lily. She had no one to turn to, no escape from the tightening noose of Reed's control. In her quiet moments, Rachel's mind wandered to darker places. She knew that Reed wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. He had already taken so much from her, and now he wanted her daughter. The thought sickened her, and she began to feel trapped in an inescapable cycle of abuse. She considered going to the police, but fear kept her silent. Fear of Reed's threats, fear of her past being exposed, fear of what Greg and Lily would think of her if they knew what had been happening all these months. Rachel was suffocating under the weight of her secret, and she could no longer see a way out. As Reed's pressure mounted, so did Rachel's anger. At first, it simmered beneath the surface, buried under layers of fear and shame, but slowly it began to build. Each time Reed called or sent a message, demanding to see her, reminding her of his power, Rachel's resentment grew. She resented Reed for exploiting her vulnerability, for destroying the small semblance of stability she had fought so hard to create. She resented herself for not stopping it sooner, for allowing him to manipulate her. But most of all, she feared that if she didn't act soon, she would lose the most precious thing in her life, her daughter. One night after another disturbing call from Reed in which he reiterated his demand to see Lily, something inside Rachel snapped. The panic that had consumed her for so long turned into rage. She realized that she could no longer endure the torment, the manipulation, and the fear. She knew that there was no reasoning with Reed. He wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted, and Rachel couldn't allow that to happen. Not to her daughter. Never. In the days that followed, Rachel began to formulate a plan. It wasn't fully conscious at first, just fleeting thoughts, desperate ideas born out of panic. She considered fleeing with her children, disappearing without a trace. But that wouldn't stop Reed from looking for them. He knew too much, had too much power over her life. Running wouldn't solve the problem. She realized that, to end the nightmare once and for all, she had to confront Reed. But this time, it wouldn't be a conversation. This time, Rachel knew she had to do something drastic. Rachel's behavior grew more erratic as her internal struggle intensified. She began preparing for the confrontation. Though no one around her could see the storm brewing, she became obsessed with thoughts of what Reed might do next, imagining him taking control of her life even further, hurting her daughter, or even her son. These thoughts consumed her, and with each passing day, her resolve hardened. The plan became clearer in her mind. Rachel could no longer live in fear. The thought of Reed touching Lily fueled a determination she had never felt before. She would do anything, anything to protect her daughter, even if it meant destroying herself in the process. There was no turning back now. She wasn't sure when, but she knew the confrontation was coming soon. She had played along with Reed's manipulation for too long, and it was time to reclaim her life, to save her children from the nightmare that had consumed her. Rachel was no longer the same woman she had been when she first walked into the church. She was now a mother on the brink, pushed to the very edge by the weight of her fear and shame. There was only one way out, and she was prepared to take it. On a cold, silent evening, Rachel received yet another message from Pastor Reed. The message was more insistent, more chilling than before. It wasn't just a reminder of his control over her. It was a direct threat to her daughter, Lily. Reed demanded that Rachel bring her to him, his words laced with veiled promises of spiritual guidance that made Rachel's skin crawl. Her mind raced. She knew that Reed would never stop, not until he got what he wanted. The thought of Lily falling into his hands filled Rachel with a rage and fear so intense that it blurred her judgment. That night, Rachel made a decision. She couldn't run from Reed anymore. She couldn't wait for him to destroy her family, to violate the most precious thing in her life. The fear that had paralyzed her for so long transformed into something darker, something more powerful. Rage, desperation, the need to protect her daughter at any cost consumed her, and in that moment, Rachel realized what she had to do. She grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, her hands trembling but determined. The weight of it in her grip was heavy, cold, a stark reminder of what she was about to do. But this wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. It was about ending the nightmare before Reed could harm Lily the way he had harmed her. She couldn't allow him to have that power. Not anymore. Rachel drove to the church in silence, her mind laser-focused on the task ahead. Her breath was shallow, her pulse racing, but there was no turning back. She arrived at the church, its large, dark silhouette looming against the night sky. She knew Reed would be there. He was always there, preparing for his sermons or running late-night meetings. The place that had once symbolized sanctuary and redemption for Rachel now felt like a prison, a place where her spirit had been slowly broken. She parked a short distance from the church, every movement deliberate, her senses heightened. The walk to the door felt like it stretched for miles, every step echoing in her ears. As she entered the building, The familiar scent of old wood and musty carpet filled her nostrils, a sharp contrast to the dread building inside her. She found Reed in his office, seated at his desk, reviewing notes for Sunday's sermon. The glow from a single lamp cast long shadows on the walls, the room dim and silent except for the soft scratch of his pen. He didn't notice her at first, lost in his work, his back to the door. But when Rachel stormed into the room, her face set in stone, he looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Rachel, what are you—" Before he could finish, she slammed the door shut behind her. The tension in the room was suffocating. Reed's eyes flicked to the knife in her hand, and for the first time, he seemed to realize that his grip over her was slipping. The calm authority he usually wielded faltered, replaced by an edge of nervousness. He stood up, trying to assert control, but it was clear Rachel had come with a purpose that he hadn't anticipated. "What do you think you're doing?" Reed's voice trembled slightly as he spoke, his facade of confidence cracking. "You need to calm down. Think about what you're doing." Rachel, her voice tight with fury, responded through gritted teeth. "I'm done thinking. I'm done being afraid. You will never touch my daughter. Ever." Reed's expression darkened. He attempted to regain his footing, leaning into the same manipulative tactics that had worked so well before. He reminded her of her past, of the criminal record he could expose, of the power he still held over her life. But this time, Rachel didn't flinch. His threats, once so terrifying, now seemed hollow. She had nothing left to lose. The confrontation quickly escalated. Reed moved toward her, his voice rising as he tried to intimidate her. But Rachel was beyond fear now. She had endured too much, suffered too long under his control. Years of manipulation, coercion, and humiliation boiled over in a moment of pure, raw rage. Without hesitation, Rachel lunged forward. The knife in her hand moved instinctively, slashing through the air with a force she didn't know she had. Reed, caught off guard, stumbled backward, clutching at the first wound as blood began to stain his shirt. His eyes widened in shock as he tried to grapple with what was happening. But Rachel was relentless. Her hands, slick with sweat and adrenaline, gripped the knife tighter as she plunged it into him again and again, each strike fueled by the terror and anger that had built inside her for so long. The struggle was brief but brutal. Reed fought back, but he was no match for Rachel's desperation. With each stab, she felt the weight of his control lift, the chains that had bound her for so long snapping one by one. When it was over, Reed collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air as his lifeblood pooled around him. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Rachel's heavy breathing. She stood over him, panting, her chest heaving, the knife still clenched in her trembling hand. Reed's body lay still, the life draining from him in slow, shallow breaths until there was nothing left. His eyes, once so cold and calculating, were now blank, lifeless. Rachel, her body shaking with a mix of horror and relief, dropped the knife to the floor with a dull clatter. The weight of what she had done settled in her chest, but for the first time in months, the fear was gone. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at Reed's lifeless form. The man who had controlled every aspect of her life, who had threatened her family and tormented her for so long, was finally dead. But the reality of the situation quickly set in. The blood on her hands, the body on the floor. There was no undoing what had just happened. She had crossed a line, and there would be no going back. Rachel knew she couldn't stay. The church was no longer a place of salvation, but a crime scene. She had to leave, but as she turned toward the door, the enormity of what she had done weighed heavily on her shoulders. The aftermath of Pastor Reed's murder sent shockwaves through the community. Rachel was arrested within hours of the incident. Her blood-stained clothes and the knife at the scene left little doubt about her involvement. She was charged with manslaughter, and though she had acted in a moment of desperation, the weight of her actions felt suffocating. As she sat in the cold, sterile confines of a jail cell, Rachel knew that life as she had known it was over. The investigation into Pastor Reed's life revealed a far darker history than anyone had imagined. During Rachel's trial, the truth about Reed's manipulation and abuse came to light. He had been using his position of power within the church to prey on vulnerable women, blackmailing them under the guise of spiritual guidance. Witnesses from the congregation, some of whom had their own suspicions about Reed, began to come forward. Rachel's legal team argued that she had been pushed to the edge by Reed's relentless coercion and threats to expose her past. The most harrowing revelation, however, was Reed's demand that Rachel bring her daughter, Lily, into his twisted world. Rachel's defense revolved around the trauma she had endured. In court, she appeared as a broken woman who had been pushed beyond the limits of her humanity. She recounted how Reed had manipulated her, threatened her with her criminal past, and destroyed her peace of mind, leading her to the only decision she believed could protect her family: killing him. The details of the abuse painted a grim picture of a predator disguised as a pastor, who had long been hiding his true nature behind the veneer of faith and authority. As the trial progressed, the community around the church began to fracture. Congregants who had once revered Pastor Reed as a spiritual guide were left grappling with the horrific truths being revealed in court. Many questioned how such corruption could have remained hidden for so long. Some members of the church openly condemned the leadership for not recognizing Reed's predatory behavior, while others clung to denial, unable to reconcile the pastor they had known with the monster being described in court. The media seized on the scandal, turning Rachel's case into a national story. Headlines focused on the shocking double life of Pastor Reed and the tragic consequences of his exploitation of power. News outlets followed every detail, portraying Rachel as both a villain and a victim, a mother driven to murder by fear and desperation, trapped in a situation from which she saw no escape. The case exposed not only the darkness within the church, but also the vulnerability of women like Rachel, who had few resources and felt cornered by a system designed to protect men like Reed. As the trial neared its conclusion, public opinion began to shift in Rachel's favor. Many saw her as a victim of a predatory man who had exploited his position for personal gain. Her legal team emphasized the extreme circumstances she had faced, painting Reed as a manipulative figure who had preyed on her vulnerabilities and left her with no other option. While the prosecution argued that Rachel had committed a violent crime, the defense's portrayal of her as a mother trying to protect her daughter from a predator resonated deeply with the jury and the public. In the end, Rachel was convicted of manslaughter, but her sentence was far lighter than expected. The judge acknowledged the abuse she had suffered at the hands of Pastor Reed and took into account the overwhelming psychological pressure that had driven her to act. The courtroom was filled with a mix of relief and somberness as the verdict was read. Rachel, though facing time in prison, knew that she had saved her daughter from a fate worse than her own. The fallout from the trial rippled through the church and the local community. The congregation that once held Pastor Reed in high regard now faced an identity crisis, as many members left the church in disgust, while others remained, trying to rebuild what had been shattered. Church leadership faced intense scrutiny, with several elders resigning amidst accusations that they had failed to see the warning signs of Reed's behavior. For many, the once sacred place of worship had become a symbol of betrayal. Despite her imprisonment, Rachel found a measure of peace in knowing that Lily was safe. She had endured unimaginable torment, but she had also broken free from Reed's control. The price she paid was steep, but in her mind, it was worth it to protect her family. Though she would spend years behind bars, she held on to the belief that she had done what was necessary to stop a man who had inflicted so much harm, not only on her, but on others as well. In the spring of 2014, Ryan Daniels found himself standing at a crossroads. At 40 years old, he had lived through more than his fair share of hardship. His struggle with drug addiction had defined the better part of his adult life, pulling him into a vicious cycle of arrests, broken promises, and ultimately, a prison sentence. The time behind bars had given him plenty of moments to reflect on what he had lost: his sense of self, the trust of his family, and his freedom. Now freshly released from a rehabilitation program, Ryan was determined to stay clean. He wanted to be the man he once promised his wife, Sarah, he would become. He wanted to be the father his 14-year-old son, Ethan, could look up to. For Ryan, recovery wasn't just about staying off drugs. It was about rebuilding a life from the ground up. He had seen rock bottom, and the only way forward was up. He knew he couldn't do it alone, so he turned to faith for guidance. He had grown up loosely attending church as a child, but in the years of addiction, he had drifted far from anything resembling a spiritual connection. Now, though, he believed that maybe God was his last hope. If he could find forgiveness within the walls of a church, perhaps he could forgive himself. That's how Ryan found himself at a local Baptist church in Jackson, Mississippi, where Pastor Tom Caldwell was a figure of respect and reverence in the community. Caldwell was known for his fiery sermons and his commitment to helping those who had lost their way. He had built a reputation as a man who could guide even the most troubled souls back to the path of righteousness, and Ryan saw in him the potential to be a mentor. The pastor welcomed him warmly when Ryan first walked through the doors of the church, a gesture that filled him with hope. It felt like a second chance. Ryan started attending services every Sunday, sitting quietly in the back pews, trying to absorb the peace the church seemed to offer. Sarah, who had stood by him through the darkest times, was cautiously optimistic. She had seen Ryan try to get clean before, only to relapse and fall back into the clutches of addiction. But this time felt different. There was a sense of real commitment in him now. When Ryan talked about faith and redemption, his words had weight. He wasn't just going through the motions. He truly believed this was the path he needed to follow. Sarah encouraged him, even suggesting that their son, Ethan, join him for services. Ethan had grown up watching his father battle addiction, and it had strained their relationship. But deep down, the teenager longed for the kind of connection with his father that he had always missed. If church could bring them closer together, Sarah was all for it. Ethan, though skeptical at first, reluctantly agreed to attend a few services with his father. He didn't quite understand the change he saw in Ryan. It was as if his father had become a stranger overnight, trading his rough edges for a calmness Ethan had never witnessed before. Pastor Caldwell took notice of Ethan as well, making it a point to greet him after each service and express how proud he was of Ryan's progress. It all seemed too good to be true, but for the first time in years, Ryan felt like his life was moving in the right direction. Caldwell offered Ryan one-on-one counseling sessions as part of the church's support for those recovering from addiction. The sessions began innocently enough. Caldwell seemed genuinely interested in Ryan's recovery, asking about his progress, his fears, and his plans for the future. It felt good for Ryan to talk to someone who wasn't judging him for his past mistakes. Pastor Caldwell always ended their conversations with words of encouragement, reminding Ryan that God had a plan for him and that redemption was within reach. As the weeks went on, Ryan began to settle into a new routine. He had found steady work as a construction laborer, and though the job was hard and exhausting, it gave him purpose. After years of drifting, he finally had structure in his life. Work during the week, church on Sundays, counseling sessions with Caldwell, and quiet evenings with his family. The anxiety and guilt that had followed him like a shadow were still there, but the edges were beginning to soften. The weight of his past wasn't gone, but it felt more manageable. Sarah, too, was beginning to breathe easier. She had spent years worrying that each time Ryan left the house, it might be the last time she saw him sober. But now, for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. She had been strong for so long, holding the family together through Ryan's years of addiction and absence, and now it seemed like maybe, just maybe, things would finally settle into something resembling normalcy. Ethan, on the other hand, remained cautious. He wanted to believe that his father had changed, but the memories of disappointment and broken promises were hard to shake. Still, seeing Ryan commit to something, seeing him show up for church every week and talk with Pastor Caldwell, gave Ethan a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the start of something real. The Daniels family seemed to be on the path to recovery, with Ryan finding stability in his faith, Sarah daring to dream of a brighter future, and Ethan slowly opening up to the idea that his father might be the man he had always hoped for. At first, everything seemed to be going well for Ryan Daniels. Pastor Caldwell had extended a hand to help him when no one else would, offering private counseling sessions and emotional support to guide him through his recovery. Caldwell often reminded Ryan that redemption was possible, but only if he fully committed to turning his life around, spiritually, mentally, and emotionally. Ryan was grateful for the attention and the personal investment Caldwell seemed to have in his well-being. For the first time in years, someone believed in his potential. It gave Ryan hope, something that had been in short supply for far too long. The counseling sessions started innocently enough. Pastor Caldwell would ask about Ryan's struggles with addiction, the emotional toll it had taken on his family, and his hopes for the future. At first, the sessions were a safe space for Ryan to open up about his guilt, his fear of relapse, and his uncertainty about the future. He felt like Caldwell was a lifeline, someone who genuinely cared about his progress and wanted to see him succeed. However, as the weeks passed, Ryan began to notice subtle changes in the way Caldwell interacted with him. The pastor's compliments, which had once been about Ryan's spiritual growth and strength, started to take on a more personal tone. Caldwell would frequently tell Ryan that he was a handsome man and that he had a strong presence, comments that left Ryan feeling uneasy. These compliments didn't seem to fit the context of their conversations about faith and recovery, and they made Ryan feel uncomfortable in ways he couldn't fully explain. Initially, Ryan brushed it off. After all, Pastor Caldwell had done nothing but help him. Perhaps he was just being too sensitive, paranoid even after years of mistrusting people due to his addiction. Maybe he was reading too much into innocent gestures and remarks. But there was something about the way Caldwell's hand would linger a bit too long on his shoulder after their sessions, or how his gaze would follow him in a way that made the hair on the back of Ryan's neck stand up. During one session, Caldwell began speaking more intimately, asking questions that seemed to push past the boundaries of their typical counseling topics. "How do you feel about yourself as a man?" Caldwell asked, his tone soft but probing. Ryan felt his stomach tighten at the question, unsure of how to respond. He muttered something about trying to be a better husband and father, but Caldwell didn't let the subject drop. "You should take pride in your strength," Caldwell continued, his eyes lingering on Ryan's face. "You've overcome so much. That's an attractive quality in a man, you know." The words sent a cold shiver down Ryan's spine, but he forced a smile, telling himself once again that he was being paranoid. Caldwell was just being kind, just trying to boost his confidence, right? He didn't know how to interpret the strange feelings that were bubbling up inside him. Was it his past mistrust of authority figures coming back to haunt him? Or was there something more sinister beneath Caldwell's words? As the counseling sessions continued, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Caldwell's physical gestures, once reassuring pats on the back, started to feel more invasive. During a recent conversation, the pastor's hand had slid down from Ryan's shoulder, grazing his back before resting lower than Ryan was comfortable with. It was subtle, but Ryan felt frozen in place, unsure of how to react. His first instinct was to pull away, but he didn't want to seem ungrateful or disrespectful, especially not to the man who had offered him so much help. Ryan kept these feelings to himself, not wanting to alarm Sarah or burden her with more worries. She had been so supportive of his involvement with the church, and he didn't want to give her any reason to doubt his commitment to staying on the right path. Besides, how could he explain these uncomfortable moments to her without sounding crazy? He barely understood them himself. Instead, he began to avoid certain situations with Caldwell, making excuses to leave sessions early or skipping them altogether. But avoiding Caldwell wasn't easy. As the pastor of the church, Caldwell was deeply ingrained in the community, and he had a way of always being around, always watching. After Sunday services, he would make it a point to approach Ryan, offering him praise and encouragement in front of the congregation. "We're so proud of your progress," he would say loudly, placing a firm hand on Ryan's back. Ryan would force a smile, feeling the eyes of the congregation on him, not wanting to cause a scene or draw attention to the awkwardness he was feeling. Even Ethan had noticed how much time Pastor Caldwell spent around Ryan. "Dad, why does Pastor Caldwell always want to talk to you?" Ethan asked one afternoon after church, his voice filled with innocent curiosity. Ryan's heart sank. He hadn't realized how obvious it had become, and he didn't have an answer that wouldn't raise more questions. He brushed it off with a joke, telling Ethan that the pastor just liked to check up on him, but inside, Ryan's unease was turning into full-blown anxiety. Ryan's mind raced. Was he imagining things? Was he reading too much into the situation? Or was there something more dangerous lurking beneath Caldwell's friendly exterior? The thought gnawed at him day and night, leaving him restless and on edge. He didn't know who to turn to, who would believe him if he voiced his suspicions. As the tension built, Ryan's once clear path to redemption started to blur. The church, which had been a place of solace and salvation, now felt like a trap, and Pastor Caldwell's once comforting presence was now a source of dread. He knew something was wrong, but he wasn't sure how to escape it without unraveling everything he had worked so hard to rebuild. Ryan found himself at a dangerous crossroads once again, but this time it wasn't addiction or the law that threatened his fragile new life. It was the very man he had trusted to help him. That evening, after the church service, Ryan Daniels stood outside Pastor Caldwell's office, filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. Over the past few weeks, these private meetings had become more frequent, initially offering Ryan guidance and support during his path to recovery. But as time went on, the tone of these meetings had shifted. The warmth and encouragement that once characterized the sessions had been replaced by something colder and more unsettling. As Ryan entered the office, the atmosphere immediately felt wrong. Caldwell no longer had the compassionate air of a spiritual mentor. Instead, he sat behind his desk with a calculating expression, watching Ryan with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Something about this moment felt definitive, as if it were leading to an inevitable conclusion. The conversation began with familiar questions about Ryan's progress, his sobriety, his work, and his relationship with his family. Yet there was a sharpness to Caldwell's words, as if he were probing for weaknesses. The shift came when Caldwell brought up Ryan's criminal record, reminding him of the fragility of his newfound freedom and the ever-present threat of returning to prison. Ryan felt a chill as Caldwell continued, making it clear just how easily his life could spiral out of control again. It wasn't just a vague threat, it was a calculated warning. His parole status, his reputation, everything Ryan had worked to rebuild could be stripped away if the wrong people were informed about his past. Ryan's mind raced as the implications of Caldwell's words sank in. The realization hit him hard. Caldwell wasn't just offering spiritual guidance anymore. He was using Ryan's past as leverage. The pastor made it clear that Ryan's future safety and stability were dependent on him complying with a very different kind of demand. The unspoken message was clear. In exchange for Caldwell keeping Ryan's past hidden, he expected something in return, something that crossed all moral boundaries. Ryan's stomach twisted with disgust and fear. He had trusted Caldwell, seeing him as a beacon of hope, but now he was trapped. The pastor's manipulation had been unfolding slowly, but it had finally culminated in this moment. Refusal would mean not only risking his freedom, but also his family's future. The stakes were too high. Thoughts of his wife, Sarah, and their son, Ethan, filled Ryan's mind. The idea of betraying the woman who had stood by him through his darkest times was unbearable. Yet the fear of losing everything he had worked to rebuild overwhelmed him. Caldwell had all the power, and Ryan felt utterly helpless. Realizing he had no other option, Ryan gave in. The decision weighed on him like a crushing burden. He had surrendered to Caldwell's manipulation, forced into a nightmare that shattered his hopes of redemption. As he left the office, the reality of what lay ahead settled heavily on his shoulders. His journey, once filled with the promise of healing and change, had turned into something much darker. Ryan walked out of the church that night, feeling like a man condemned, uncertain of how he would escape the nightmare that Caldwell had trapped him in. The very person who had promised salvation had instead dragged him into a deeper, more terrifying form of entrapment. As the weeks passed, Ryan's life slowly unraveled. The affair with Pastor Caldwell continued, each meeting leaving him feeling more hollow and disconnected from the man he once was. The weight of his secret, combined with the pastor's growing control over him, crushed Ryan's spirit. He was a man on the edge, barely holding on as he navigated the dark labyrinth Caldwell had led him into. At home, Sarah sensed that something was deeply wrong with her husband. Ryan had always been open with her, especially since he had left behind his troubled past. But now there was a growing distance between them. He was no longer the man she had fought so hard to support. He was distant, his mood shifting unpredictably from silence to frustration. Sarah tried to ask what was troubling him, but Ryan, unable to bear the guilt and fear, shut her out. Every time Sarah looked at him with concern in her eyes, Ryan felt a stab of shame. He hated lying to her, hated the deceit that was slowly poisoning their relationship. But the terror of her discovering the truth, of her finding out that he was trapped in an unwanted affair with the pastor, was more than he could handle. Each day, the walls around him seemed to close in a little tighter. Sarah's confusion and growing sadness weighed on him, but he couldn't bring himself to admit the horror he was living through. At the same time, Ryan's relationship with his 14-year-old son, Ethan, also began to suffer. Ryan had once taken great pride in being there for Ethan, guiding him through life with the lessons learned from his own mistakes. But now paranoia gripped him. He became increasingly overprotective of Ethan, fearing that Caldwell's influence might extend to his son. Every time Ethan walked into the church, Ryan felt his stomach knot with anxiety. He would watch Caldwell's every move, dreading that the pastor's dark manipulations would turn toward his family. Caldwell, aware of Ryan's growing discomfort, tightened his grip. The pastor's manipulation became more sinister, feeding off Ryan's vulnerability. He would subtly remind Ryan of the precarious nature of his freedom, hinting that one wrong move could unravel everything Ryan had rebuilt. It wasn't just the affair that weighed on Ryan now. It was the constant threat of exposure, the knowledge that Caldwell could destroy his life with a single phone call. The pastor made sure Ryan understood this power dynamic, and Ryan, terrified of losing everything, found himself unable to resist. Ryan's descent into despair began to manifest in other ways. He couldn't sleep, his nights filled with anxiety-ridden dreams and thoughts that raced uncontrollably. His behavior became erratic, snapping at Sarah for minor things, isolating himself in their home, and becoming increasingly irritable. Sarah, confused and heartbroken, tried everything she could to bridge the growing gap, but Ryan refused to let her in. The love they once shared was being choked by the weight of his secret, and it was tearing their marriage apart. On the outside, Ryan still tried to maintain the facade of a man who had turned his life around. He attended church regularly, keeping up appearances for the congregation and for his family. But inside, he was drowning. Every time he stepped into the church, every time he saw Caldwell, the guilt gnawed at him. He couldn't escape the pastor's control, and the knowledge of that helplessness consumed him. Ryan's mental state deteriorated further. He found himself unable to focus on work, barely able to keep his job. His once strong bond with Ethan began to fray, as Ryan's paranoia made him increasingly controlling. He would insist on knowing where Ethan was at all times, even growing agitated when Ethan spent too much time at church. The more Ryan tried to protect his son, the more he realized how deeply trapped he was in Caldwell's web. As the days turned into weeks, Ryan knew he was reaching a breaking point. His marriage was falling apart, his mind was unraveling, and the dark shadow of Pastor Caldwell loomed larger than ever. He had lost control of his life, and no matter what he did, he couldn't find a way out. The guilt, fear, and shame weighed down on him like a suffocating blanket, and Ryan could feel himself edging closer and closer to a point of no return. The man who had once sought redemption now felt like he was spiraling into a deeper darkness. The breaking point for Ryan Daniels came on an overcast afternoon in the summer of 2014, a day that started like any other but ended with his entire world crashing down around him. For months, Pastor Caldwell had been controlling Ryan, manipulating him with threats and exploiting his past criminal record and his ongoing struggles with addiction. Ryan had endured Caldwell's hold over him, terrified of losing everything he had worked so hard to rebuild: his family, his freedom, his future. But when the pastor made his latest demand, everything changed. Ryan had gone to the church for what he thought would be another routine meeting with Caldwell, hoping to endure whatever new manipulations the pastor had in store. However, what Caldwell proposed that day was something Ryan hadn't anticipated. The pastor wanted more than control over Ryan. He wanted access to Ryan's 14-year-old son, Ethan. Caldwell framed it as spiritual guidance for the boy, but Ryan knew better. The suggestion that Ethan could be involved in this sick game filled him with a terror and fury he had never known. Ryan's immediate reaction was disbelief. How could anyone, especially a man of God, ask for something so vile? The thought alone made his skin crawl. He refused outright, standing his ground for the first time since Caldwell had begun manipulating him. There was no way he would ever let the pastor near his son, but Caldwell was relentless. He didn't back down. Instead, he escalated his threats. Caldwell reminded Ryan of all the power he held. He knew about Ryan's criminal past, his history with drugs, and his ongoing parole. If Ryan didn't comply, Caldwell threatened to expose everything, not just to the church community, but to the authorities. He could make sure Ryan's parole officer heard about his relapse, ensuring a swift return to prison. He could destroy Ryan's marriage by revealing the affair, leaving Ryan alone and humiliated. The pastor's threats were clear. Either Ryan did as he was told, or he would lose everything. For days, Ryan could hardly think straight. The pressure was unbearable, his mind racing with fear and guilt. He had already sacrificed so much, allowing himself to be manipulated by Caldwell. But this was different. His son was innocent, completely unaware of the storm brewing around him. The very thought of Ethan being targeted by Caldwell filled Ryan with a protective rage. There was no way he could allow it, no matter the cost. But Ryan felt trapped. He was suffocating under the weight of the pastor's threats. Caldwell seemed omnipresent, always lurking in the background, reminding Ryan of his control. Every time Ryan thought about standing up to him, he was paralyzed by fear. What if Caldwell followed through on his threats? What if Ryan lost his family, went back to prison, or became the subject of a public scandal? The walls were closing in, and Ryan's mental state began to unravel. The pressure of the situation pushed him to his breaking point. He became more withdrawn from Sarah, unable to tell her the truth about what was happening. Ethan noticed his father's distant, erratic behavior, but he was too young to understand the full scope of the crisis. Ryan was isolated, battling the demons in his mind and the very real threat that Caldwell posed to his life. Ryan tried to find a solution, searching for any way out of the nightmare. But each time he thought he had found a way forward, the pastor's hold on him grew tighter. Caldwell had made sure there was no escape. Ryan's every move was shadowed by the pastor's threats, and the weight of the ultimatum became too much to bear. In his darkest moments, Ryan found himself contemplating the unthinkable. His anger toward Caldwell grew with each passing day, a simmering rage that he could no longer contain. He couldn't allow the pastor to destroy his family, to target Ethan. The fear that had once paralyzed him was slowly transforming into something more dangerous: desperation. Ryan's thoughts became consumed with how to end the torment, how to protect his son from the pastor's grip. There was no going to the authorities, no telling Sarah the truth. In Ryan's mind, Caldwell had left him with only one option. The pastor had to be stopped, and Ryan would be the one to stop him. As the days passed, the rage built until it finally reached a boiling point. Ryan could no longer live with the fear, the manipulation, and the threats. The thought of Ethan being dragged into this nightmare was more than he could bear. The pastor had pushed him too far, and now there was no turning back. Ryan's breaking point wasn't a sudden moment. It was the culmination of months of torment and abuse. It was the realization that there was no escape, no other way to protect his family. The man who had come to the church seeking redemption had been pushed to the edge, and the only way out was through the unthinkable. As Ryan made his decision, the fear and panic gave way to a chilling clarity. He knew what he had to do. One evening in late 2014, Ryan Daniels made the irreversible decision that would change his life forever. After weeks of manipulation and escalating threats from Pastor Caldwell, Ryan knew he couldn't allow the torment to continue. His 14-year-old son, Ethan, was in danger, and the weight of the pastor's demands had pushed Ryan to a breaking point. Caldwell's control over him had evolved from subtle manipulation to outright coercion, and Ryan saw no other way out. Gripping the handle of a kitchen knife, Ryan's mind raced with the consequences of his decision. All day he had wrestled with the plan, but by nightfall, desperation overtook him. The fear that had once immobilized him gave way to a steely resolve. The only thought in his mind was to end the nightmare and protect his family, no matter what the cost. The church was quiet when Ryan arrived. It was after hours and the building was locked, but Ryan knew Caldwell would be there, working late as usual, preparing for Sunday's sermon. Ryan's footsteps echoed through the empty halls as he made his way to the pastor's office. His heart pounded in his chest and his hand tightened around the knife in his coat pocket as he mentally rehearsed the confrontation. When Ryan pushed open the door to the office, he found Caldwell seated behind his desk, calmly flipping through papers. The sight of the pastor, calm and composed, unaware of what was about to happen, only fueled Ryan's mounting rage. As Caldwell looked up, it was clear he hadn't expected Ryan at that moment, though he didn't seem concerned. Ryan's pulse quickened as he stood in the doorway, feeling the weight of everything Caldwell had done to him. This man, who once appeared to be a guide, had twisted his life into something unrecognizable. Every threat, every manipulative gesture, and every dark secret Caldwell forced him to keep filled the air with tension. The pastor, sensing a shift in Ryan's demeanor, stood up from his desk, trying to exert control as he always had. But this time, Ryan wasn't intimidated. The months of control and manipulation had built up inside him like a ticking time bomb. And now, in this moment, it all exploded. In a blur of motion, Ryan lunged forward, pulling the knife from his coat pocket and striking Caldwell. The first stab caught him in the chest, shocking the pastor and causing him to stumble backward. But Ryan didn't stop. Fueled by a cocktail of rage, fear, and desperation, he struck again and again. The violence consumed him, and each stab seemed to release a flood of pent-up emotions, years of fear, shame, and helplessness. The sound of the blade meeting flesh echoed in the small office, a stark contrast to the silence that followed. By the time Ryan realized what he had done, it was too late. Caldwell collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around his body. The man who had once held so much power over Ryan now lay lifeless at his feet. The knife slipped from Ryan's trembling hand, clattering to the floor. He stood over the body, his chest heaving, breath ragged, as the full weight of his actions crashed down on him. The silence in the church was overwhelming. For a brief moment, the only sound Ryan could hear was his own breathing. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor, his hands covered in blood. Horror and relief washed over him in equal measure. It was over, but at what cost? Minutes later, the police arrived, alerted by the church's security system. The flashing lights illuminated the darkened hallways as officers rushed inside. Ryan didn't resist when they found him. He was too numb to react, too broken by the events of the past few months. He sat motionless as the officers handcuffed him and led him out of the church, leaving the bloody scene behind. The investigation that followed uncovered the truth about Pastor Caldwell's manipulations and abuse of power. The once loyal congregation was horrified by the revelations. Many were in disbelief that their trusted spiritual leader had exploited his position to control and manipulate vulnerable people like Ryan. Caldwell's dark actions were exposed, shocking the entire community. Ryan was eventually convicted of murder, but there was sympathy for his situation. As the media covered the trial, the full extent of Caldwell's manipulative control became clear. Ryan was seen not only as a man who had committed a violent act, but also as someone who had been pushed to the edge by a predator using his authority for personal gain. The aftermath of the tragedy left Ryan's family shattered. Sarah and Ethan were left to cope with the horror of what had transpired. Yet for Ryan, even behind bars, there was a small measure of peace. He had protected his son from Caldwell, sparing him from the nightmare that had haunted him for months. The cost was immense, but Ryan believed it was worth paying to protect his family from the evil that had infiltrated their lives. The once peaceful church community was forever changed, the dark truth that had been hiding within its walls exposed for all to see.
Angela Davis, a 45-year-old African-American woman, lived in a modest, two-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn with her 16-year-old daughter, Kayla. The apartment, though small, had been their home for years. It sat on the third floor of a weathered brick building, where the windows rattled in the winter wind, and the walls carried the faint sound of neighbors' lives. Angela had never imagined she would be raising Kayla alone, but life had taken an unexpected turn when her husband walked out on them more than a decade ago. Since then, Angela had been forced to adapt, becoming both mother and father to her daughter, doing her best to shield Kayla from the harshness of the world. Angela worked as a secretary at a small law firm in downtown Brooklyn. It wasn't the job she had once dreamed of, but it paid the bills. Most days, she felt grateful simply to have stable work, even if it meant long hours and dealing with demanding clients. There were days when the weight of balancing work, bills, and motherhood seemed unbearable. The nights were the hardest, when Kayla was asleep and the apartment grew quiet, Angela felt the loneliness creeping in, a constant reminder of the life she had once imagined for herself that never materialized. One of the few places Angela found peace was at the local Baptist church. Faith had always been a cornerstone of her life, and after her husband left, it became even more important. Every Sunday, she attended services at Second Zion Baptist Church, where the sermons were passionate and the congregation felt like family. It was here that she first noticed Pastor Charles Matthews, a man who would soon change her life. Charles Matthews, a 55-year-old African-American widower, had been the pastor of Second Zion for over a decade. He was well-known and highly respected in the community. Unlike many pastors, Charles had accumulated significant wealth thanks to wise investments and the inheritance left by his late wife. He lived in a grand house in a more affluent part of the city and drove a sleek, black luxury car that gleamed in the sunlight. But despite his wealth, Charles was humble, or so it seemed. He was generous with his time and money, often organizing charity drives, feeding the homeless, and offering scholarships to underprivileged youth. His sermons were powerful, filled with charisma and conviction, drawing people from all over the borough to his church. Angela had always admired Charles from afar, watching him lead the congregation with grace and confidence. He seemed like a man of principle, someone who had a deep connection with the community, and most importantly, someone who could offer stability. After her years of struggling on her own, the idea of stability, both emotional and financial, was incredibly appealing. It started innocently enough. Charles would smile at her during services, offering kind words as she exited the church. Then, one day, he invited her and Kayla to dinner. Angela was flattered. A dinner invitation from the pastor was no small gesture, and she felt a thrill of excitement as she accepted. The evening was spent at a fine restaurant downtown, where Charles paid for everything without a second thought. Kayla, who was usually quiet around new people, was shy but respectful. Angela, however, was captivated by Charles's charm. He spoke about his plans for expanding the church's outreach programs, his passion for helping those in need, and how much he admired Angela's dedication as a single mother. Over the next few months, Charles continued to show interest in Angela. He invited her to more church events, dinners, and even private meetings where they discussed her involvement in the church's charity efforts. Kayla, though not particularly enthusiastic about the attention, didn't resist. For Angela, Charles represented something she had long craved, a chance to step out of survival mode and into a life where she could focus on herself again, where she didn't have to bear the weight of everything alone. Charles's wealth wasn't lost on Angela either. It wasn't that she was materialistic, but after years of scraping by, the thought of financial security was intoxicating. Charles's house was grand, with polished wood floors, a sprawling backyard, and rooms that seemed to go on forever. His car was always freshly detailed, and his wardrobe impeccable. He exuded success, and Angela couldn't help but feel drawn to that. For the first time in years, she saw a future where she wasn't struggling, where Kayla could attend a good college, and where she could finally exhale. After several months of courting, Charles made a proposal, not marriage, but something close. He asked Angela to move in with him. He presented it as a practical decision. His house was far too large for one man, and Angela and Kayla would have their own space. They wouldn't have to worry about rent, bills, or living in a cramped apartment anymore. He assured her that Kayla's education and future would be secure. And perhaps most compellingly, he offered Angela the chance to become a partner in his charitable foundation, working alongside him to make a difference in the community. Angela hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because she was afraid of moving too quickly. She still remembered the pain of her husband abandoning her, the devastation of being left to pick up the pieces. But Charles wasn't her husband. He was steady, reliable, and respected. In the end, Angela accepted his offer, believing that this was the chance she and Kayla needed for a better life. Within weeks, Angela and Kayla packed their things and moved into Charles's home. It was a significant change. Angela now had access to luxuries she had never dreamed of: new clothes, fine dining, and a life that no longer revolved around making ends meet. Charles treated her with care and respect, always showing appreciation for her presence and her willingness to help with the church's charity work. But amid the excitement of a new beginning, there were small signs that something was off. Charles's generosity sometimes felt more like control. He insisted on making decisions for the household, from the decor to what charities Angela should focus on. And while he showered Angela with attention, he seemed distant with Kayla. Angela, eager to make this new life work, pushed aside these doubts, telling herself that she and Kayla were finally safe, finally secure. But in the quiet moments, when the house grew too large and too quiet, she couldn't help but feel that maybe things weren't as perfect as they seemed. The move to Charles's house marked a dramatic shift in Angela and Kayla's lives. Located in an affluent neighborhood in the suburbs of New York City, the sprawling home felt like a palace compared to their modest Brooklyn apartment. The front yard was perfectly manicured, with a long driveway leading up to the grand entrance. Inside, the rooms were expansive and elegantly decorated with expensive furniture, art pieces, and crystal chandeliers. It was a world far removed from what Angela had known, a place where wealth and success were on display in every corner. For Angela, the transition seemed to be a dream come true. Charles had been nothing but attentive, always making her feel valued and appreciated. He encouraged her to take on a larger role in his charitable foundation, a nonprofit that focused on providing resources and education to underprivileged youth in the city. Angela, who had always wanted to make a meaningful impact but had been too consumed with survival to pursue such work, jumped at the opportunity. She found herself immersed in the foundation's operations. Meetings with board members, organizing fundraising events, managing donations, it all became part of her daily routine. Angela felt a deep sense of fulfillment, finally doing something that not only helped others but gave her life a renewed sense of purpose. Charles, ever the supportive figure, praised her efforts and pushed her to take on more responsibilities. He introduced her to influential people in the community, donors, and city officials, expanding her network in ways she had never imagined. But as Angela's world grew larger, Kayla's world seemed to shrink. The 16-year-old never quite settled into the new house. The grandiosity of the place, with its long hallways and closed doors, felt more like a prison than a home to her. The house was cold, despite its luxury, and Kayla, already quiet and introverted by nature, began to retreat further into herself. She spent most of her time in her room, a spacious but impersonal space that lacked the warmth of their old life. Angela, caught up in her work, failed to notice the growing distance between her and Kayla. To Angela, Kayla's silence was just normal teenage behavior, something she'd eventually grow out of. When she did notice Kayla's withdrawal, she dismissed it as Kayla's difficulty adjusting to the move or just typical teenage moodiness. After all, Charles was providing them with a life of luxury and stability. What could Kayla possibly have to complain about? Charles, for his part, seemed to pay little attention to Kayla. While he was affectionate and caring toward Angela, his interactions with Kayla were distant and formal. He never raised his voice or acted harshly, but there was a certain coldness in the way he treated her, a subtle indifference that Angela brushed aside as Charles simply giving the teenager her space. Days turned into weeks, and Angela's responsibilities within the foundation grew. She attended more evening events, met with influential donors, and spent late nights at the office, working on grant proposals and coordinating projects. The foundation had become her second home, and Charles was always there to encourage her, praising her hard work and dedication. But with each passing day, Kayla felt more and more isolated. The house was too large, too quiet. When Angela was gone, she was often left alone with Charles, though he rarely interacted with her directly. His presence, however, cast a shadow over her. Something about the way he moved through the house, his constant control over the household, made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't quite explain why. She began to avoid him as much as possible, staying in her room or wandering the vast, empty halls in silence. One evening, Angela came home after yet another late-night meeting. As she walked through the front door, she was struck by how eerily silent the house was. Normally, by this time, she would hear the sound of the television or music coming from Kayla's room, but tonight there was nothing. Concerned, she made her way upstairs and found Kayla lying on her bed, curled up under the covers. Kayla looked pale, her skin ashen and her eyes distant. Angela's heart sank. It had been days since they had had a meaningful conversation. Kayla had been quiet, even more so than usual, but Angela had chalked it up to the stresses of moving and adjusting to a new life. Now, as she stood over her daughter, Angela could no longer ignore the signs. "Kayla, sweetheart, are you okay?" Angela asked, her voice soft, trying to mask the worry creeping into her tone. Kayla didn't respond at first. She simply stared ahead, her body still, as if too tired to engage. When she finally spoke, her voice was faint and strained. "I'm just tired, Mom. That's all." But Angela knew better. Something wasn't right. Kayla's face was pale, and her normally vibrant eyes were dull, as if she had been carrying a heavy burden for too long. Angela's mind raced with possibilities. Was it stress from the move? Problems at school? She hadn't even asked Kayla how she had been doing lately, too wrapped up in her new responsibilities at the foundation. "You don't look well," Angela said, reaching out to feel her daughter's forehead. "I think we should go to the doctor tomorrow. This doesn't seem like just tiredness." Kayla didn't resist, and that worried Angela even more. Usually, Kayla would protest, insisting that she was fine, that there was no need for doctors. But this time, she simply nodded, her gaze fixed on the ceiling. Angela stood there for a moment, her hand lingering on Kayla's shoulder. A wave of guilt washed over her. She had been so focused on Charles and the foundation, on building this new life, that she had lost sight of the most important person in her world. She had always prided herself on being a good mother, on being there for Kayla despite the challenges they had faced. But now, it felt like Kayla was slipping away from her, retreating into a place where Angela couldn't reach her. That night, as Angela lay in bed next to Charles, she couldn't sleep. Her mind was filled with thoughts of Kayla and the subtle signs she had missed, the pale skin, the distant eyes, the way Kayla had been quieter and more withdrawn lately. Angela had been so caught up in her own life that she hadn't realized how far apart she and Kayla had drifted. Charles, sensing her unease, turned to her in the dark. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice deep and calm. Angela hesitated. She didn't want to burden Charles with her worries. He had done so much for them already, given them this beautiful home, this new life. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. "I'm just worried about Kayla," Angela admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's been so quiet lately, and now she's not feeling well. I don't know if she's adjusting." Charles was silent for a moment before responding. "Teenagers go through phases," he said. "It's probably just the stress of moving. She'll be fine. You've done everything you can for her." Angela nodded, but the unease in her chest remained. She had hoped that moving in with Charles would bring her and Kayla closer, give them the life they had always dreamed of. But now, it felt like they were moving further apart with each passing day. And though she couldn't explain it, a quiet fear was beginning to take root, something deeper than just a mother's worry. Something about Charles's calm reassurances didn't sit right with her, though she wasn't ready to face why. Angela woke early that morning, the weight of her worry about Kayla pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. Kayla's pale skin, constant fatigue, and distant behavior had been gnawing at her for weeks. The previous night's conversation replayed in her mind. Kayla had been so quiet, so resigned. There was no way this was just the stress of moving or teenage rebellion. Something was terribly wrong, and Angela was determined to get to the bottom of it. She called the doctor's office first thing, managing to secure an appointment for that afternoon. When she told Kayla about the visit, the girl merely nodded, too drained to argue. Angela felt another pang of guilt for not noticing how far Kayla had withdrawn. How had things gotten this bad without her seeing it? The ride to the clinic was silent. Kayla sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the window, her face a mask of emotionless exhaustion. Angela's knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. But no matter how hard she tried to prepare herself, nothing could have readied her for the truth that was about to be uncovered. At the clinic, they were led into a sterile, brightly lit examination room. The doctor, a kind-looking woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose, asked Kayla a series of routine questions. Angela sat in the corner, wringing her hands, waiting for answers. After some initial tests, the doctor excused herself, leaving mother and daughter alone in the room. The silence between them was thick with unspoken questions and anxiety. Kayla hadn't spoken a word since they arrived. She just sat there, avoiding eye contact, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When the doctor returned, her expression had changed. The professional detachment was still there, but there was a new layer of concern in her eyes. She approached Angela carefully, as if bracing for the impact of what she was about to say. "I'm afraid I have some news," the doctor began, her voice gentle. "Kayla is pregnant." Angela's world seemed to stop in that moment. She felt as though the ground had fallen out from beneath her, sending her spiraling into a pit of disbelief and shock. Her heart pounded in her chest as the word pregnant echoed in her mind. Kayla? Pregnant? It didn't make sense. Angela's immediate reaction was to deny it, to think there had been some mistake, but the doctor's serious expression left no room for doubt. How far along is she?" Angela stammered, struggling to process the information. "About 12 weeks, the doctor replied. 12 weeks. Angela's mind raced, trying to piece together how this could have happened. Who was the father? Why hadn't Kayla told her? How could she have missed this? The questions flooded her mind, but one stood out above all the others. Who was responsible? She turned to Kayla, her voice trembling. "Kayla, who is the father? You have to tell me." Kayla's face crumpled at the question. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she shook her head, her lips pressed tightly together. She refused to answer, her body shaking with silent sobs. Angela stood up and knelt beside her, desperation clawing at her insides. "Kayla, please," Angela pleaded. "I need to know. Who did this to you?" But Kayla only cried harder, burying her face in her hands. She was terrified, but Angela couldn't understand why. There was something deeper here, something that went beyond teenage fear or shame. This was raw terror, and it sent a shiver down Angela's spine. Before Angela could press further, the door opened, and Charles walked in. He had insisted on coming to the clinic with them, but Angela had asked him to wait outside while the doctor ran tests. Now, seeing the tension in Kayla's tears, he stepped in like a guardian swooping down to protect his flock. "What's going on?" Charles asked, his voice calm but authoritative as he took in the scene. He looked from Angela to Kayla, his eyes narrowing slightly. "She's pregnant," Angela said, the words catching in her throat. "She won't tell me who the father is." Charles's expression remained steady, though a flicker of something, anger, maybe, passed briefly across his face. He walked over to Kayla, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "We need to stay calm," he said softly. "This is a difficult situation, but we have to trust that God has a plan. We'll get through this together." Angela blinked in disbelief. God's plan? Her daughter was pregnant, terrified, and refusing to speak, and Charles was talking about divine will? The pastor's words felt hollow to her, like he was trying to smooth over the gravity of the situation with empty platitudes. "I don't care about a plan," Angela snapped, her voice rising. "I want to know who did this to my daughter." Charles stepped in front of Kayla protectively, his voice remaining calm, but there was a steely edge beneath his words. "Angela, pushing her like this won't help. Kayla needs our support, not anger. We should be praying for guidance, not demanding answers." Angela recoiled, the tension between them thickening. She had trusted Charles. This was the man who had brought her into his home, made her feel safe and loved. But now, he was shielding Kayla from the truth. Instead of helping, he was acting as if this was some kind of test of faith. Something was wrong, but Angela couldn't put her finger on it. Her instincts screamed at her, but her mind was clouded by confusion, fear, and doubt. Charles knelt beside Kayla, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "We'll get through this, Kayla. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and perhaps this is part of His plan for you." Angela watched, frozen, as Charles spoke softly to her daughter. The way he held her, the soothing tone of his voice, it was as if he was trying to pacify her, to stop her from speaking. Angela felt a surge of unease rise up in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Was she overreacting? Was Charles right? He had always been a man of faith, someone she admired for his calmness in the face of adversity. But now, that calmness felt more like control, and it unsettled her deeply. Angela's mind raced as she stood there, watching Charles comfort Kayla. Something didn't add up. Kayla's fear, Charles's insistence that they pray instead of demand answers, it didn't feel right. But for now, she was trapped. Trapped between her faith in Charles and her instinct as a mother. Trapped between the man she trusted and the growing suspicion that something terrible was lurking beneath the surface. Angela lay awake in bed that night, unable to sleep. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and suspicions. Ever since the discovery of Kayla's pregnancy, she had been tormented by unanswered questions and an unsettling feeling in the pit of her stomach. Charles's reassurances, his insistence that everything was part of God's plan, had only deepened her sense of unease. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, but she couldn't yet grasp what it was. Charles had gone downstairs earlier, saying he needed to work on some church matters, but the quiet of the house didn't bring Angela any comfort. She tossed and turned, her mind replaying the doctor's visit, Kayla's refusal to talk, and Charles's unnerving calmness. Finally, restless and unable to bear the silence any longer, Angela slipped out of bed. She thought maybe a glass of water would help calm her nerves. As she padded softly through the hallway, she heard low voices. She paused, frowning as she realized the voices were coming from Kayla's room. Charles's deep, authoritative tone carried through the door, followed by Kayla's muffled responses. Angela's first instinct was to give them privacy, but something about the way Kayla's voice trembled made her stop. She stepped closer, standing just outside the door, the sound of her own heartbeat filling her ears. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but her mother's intuition told her this conversation was important. She leaned in, her ear just inches from the door, straining to hear what they were saying. "I told you, Kayla, this is between us." Charles's voice was low but firm. There was no trace of the soothing pastor's tone he used in church. This voice was commanding, threatening. "You mustn't tell anyone, especially your mother." Kayla's voice was barely audible, shaking with fear. "But I can't. I don't know what to do anymore." "You will do as I say," Charles interrupted, his voice cold. "If you tell anyone about what's happened, I will make sure your mother suffers for it. Do you understand?" Angela froze, her breath catching in her throat. She pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from gasping aloud. Her mind raced, trying to process what she was hearing. Charles continued, his voice like steel. "I've given you and your mother everything, a home, a better life. And I can take it all away just as easily. If you say one word about this, I will make sure both of your lives are ruined. You know I have connections, powerful friends. No one will believe you, and your mother, she will lose everything." There was a long silence, punctuated only by the sound of Kayla's soft sobs. Angela's body went rigid as the horrifying truth began to take shape in her mind. Charles was the father of Kayla's baby. The realization hit her like a freight train, knocking the breath out of her. The man she had trusted, the man she had allowed into their lives, had been manipulating and abusing her daughter under the guise of love and authority. Angela staggered backward, pressing her back against the wall to steady herself. Her heart pounded in her chest, the shock and betrayal washing over her in waves. How had she not seen this? How had she missed the signs? The way Kayla had withdrawn, the strange distance between her and Charles, the way he had been so protective of her, everything now made sickening sense. She stood there for a moment, her body trembling as she struggled to keep herself together. She couldn't let them know she had overheard. Not yet. Charles was dangerous, and now that she knew the truth, she had to be smart about what she did next. She couldn't confront him, not while he still held so much power over them. He had connections, influence. If she acted rashly, he could follow through on his threats. Angela's mind raced. She had to protect Kayla. She had to get them out of this situation, but she couldn't do it alone. She knew Charles's threats weren't empty. He had the resources to ruin their lives, and the fear he had instilled in Kayla was real and palpable. But Angela couldn't stand by and do nothing. Not anymore. For a moment, Angela considered rushing in, grabbing Kayla, and leaving the house that very night. But then she remembered Charles's connections, his influence within the church and the community. If they left in haste without a plan, Charles could easily track them down. He could smear their names, use his wealth and status to manipulate the story. They would be outnumbered, vulnerable. No, she couldn't afford to act impulsively. Angela knew she needed a plan, a way to gather evidence and protect her daughter from further harm. She would have to play her cards carefully. For now, she would continue as if nothing had changed, masking her anger and fear with calm composure. She would act as if she still trusted Charles, biding her time while she figured out how to escape his control for good. Slowly, Angela crept away from the door, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had learned. As she walked back to her room, her mind churned with possibilities. Who could she trust? Could she go to the authorities without Charles finding out? Could she gather enough proof of his abuse to ensure that he would face justice? By the time she reached her bedroom, Angela had resolved one thing for certain: Charles Matthews was not the man she thought he was. He was a monster, hiding behind the mask of a kind pastor, using his position of authority to manipulate and control. And now, her daughter was paying the price for his abuse of power. Angela slipped back into bed, her body trembling with a mixture of fear, rage, and guilt. She lay beside Charles, who would return to bed soon, unaware that his web of lies was beginning to unravel. Her heart raced as she stared at the ceiling, knowing that she would have to act carefully, strategically, if she was going to save her daughter, and herself, from the nightmare they were living in. Charles's calm voice echoed in her head, "I will make sure your mother suffers." But Angela was no longer the woman who would fall under his control. She had been blind to the truth for too long, but now her eyes were open, and she would stop at nothing to protect Kayla. As she lay there in the dark, her mind began working through every possible step she could take to bring Charles down, to free her daughter from his clutches, and to make sure they never had to live in fear of him again. The night felt endless, but Angela knew that the dawn would bring clarity. Charles had made his threats, but he had underestimated her. The next morning, Angela woke with a fire burning in her chest. The fear and shock from the night before had solidified into a cold determination. She knew what she had to do. Charles had spent months controlling her life, manipulating her trust, and most horrifyingly, exploiting her daughter under the guise of religious authority. Now, Angela had to confront him, and more importantly, protect Kayla. Angela spent the morning in a haze of suppressed emotion. Every glance at Charles, who moved around the house with his usual polished demeanor, stirred a mixture of rage and heartbreak in her. She waited until mid-morning, when Kayla was at school, to make her move. She needed to confront Charles alone, without the risk of Kayla overhearing. Charles was in his study, going over paperwork for the church's upcoming charity drive. Angela stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. He looked so calm, so composed, like nothing was wrong. But Angela could no longer be deceived by his facade. She stepped into the room, her voice steady but filled with cold resolve. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything that had been building inside her. Charles looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "Of course," he said, gesturing to a chair across from him. "What's on your mind?" Angela didn't sit. She couldn't. Her legs felt like they would give out if she stayed still. Instead, she stood in the middle of the room, fists clenched at her sides. I know what you've done, she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. I know about you and Kayla. Charles's eyes flickered for a moment, just a brief flash of something darker behind his calm expression, but then he quickly regained his composure. He set his pen down and leaned back in his chair, crossing his hands over his chest. You must be confused, Angela, he said, his voice as smooth as ever. I don't know what you think you know, but this is a misunderstanding. Angela shook her head, her anger rising. I overheard you last night. I heard you threatening her, telling her not to say anything. You're the father of her child, aren't you? Charles didn't flinch. Instead, he sighed, as if burdened by Angela's lack of understanding. Angela, he began, his tone soft, almost pitying, this is a delicate situation. Kayla and we have a special bond. She's been through so much, and I've been trying to protect her. You need to understand that going to the authorities will only make things worse, for all of us. Angela felt a surge of fury at his words. A special bond? Protecting her, **** his ability to twist the situation, to manipulate the truth so easily, sickened her. She stepped forward, her voice hardening. You've been abusing her, she spat. You've manipulated her, just like you manipulated me. And now you're trying to make this about protecting us? I'm done, Charles. I'm going to the police. Charles's expression shifted then, a subtle tightening of his jaw, a glint of anger in his eyes that he couldn't fully mask. You need to think about this carefully, Angela, he said, his voice still calm, but now laced with an undercurrent of threat. If you go to the police, they won't believe you. They'll see me as a respected pastor, a man of God, and they'll see you as a hysterical woman trying to destroy a good man's reputation. Do you really want to risk that? Angela's heart pounded, but she refused to back down. I don't care what they believe, she said through clenched teeth. I'm not letting you get away with this. Charles stood now, stepping toward her with that same calculated calm. You should be careful, Angela. I have friends, powerful people who could make your life very difficult. Think of Kayla. Think of what could happen if this goes public. Do you really want her dragged through the mud? Do you want your life ruined? Angela's stomach churned with fear, but her resolve didn't waver. She knew Charles had connections, people in high places who could make good on his threats. But she couldn't live in fear anymore, and neither could Kayla. She would not allow Charles to use his power and influence to manipulate them any longer. Without another word, Angela turned and walked out of the room, her hands shaking. She didn't need to hear any more of Charles's threats. She had heard enough. It was time to act. That afternoon, while Charles was busy with his church duties, Angela began making quiet preparations. She packed essentials, clothes, documents, anything they would need for the days ahead. She called a women's shelter she had found online earlier in the day, one that specialized in helping victims of abuse and offered legal support. They assured her that she and Kayla would be safe there, that they could help with the legal process of reporting Charles to the authorities. When Kayla came home from school, Angela sat her down, her heart aching as she looked into her daughter's eyes. Kayla was fragile, emotionally drained, but Angela could see a flicker of hope when she told her the plan. They were going to leave. Tonight. Kayla was scared, but Angela reassured her. We're going to be okay, she said, holding Kayla close. I promise you, we're going to get out of this. Later that evening, after Charles had left for a church event, Angela quietly packed the car. She and Kayla slipped out of the house unnoticed, their hearts pounding with fear and anticipation. The drive to the shelter was tense, every passing car making Angela's breath catch, but they arrived safely. At the shelter, they were met with kindness and understanding. The staff welcomed them in, offering them a safe place to stay and immediate legal advice. Angela sat down with a counselor, going over the details of what had happened. She recounted everything, Charles's threats, the abuse, the manipulation. It was painful, but Angela felt a sense of release as she spoke. For the first time, she was taking back control of her life. The counselor reassured Angela that they would help her file a report with the police. They would ensure that Charles faced justice for what he had done. As Angela lay in bed that night at the shelter, with Kayla sleeping soundly beside her, she felt a deep sense of relief. They were finally free. The nightmare was far from over. There would be investigations, trials, and the long road of recovery ahead, but Angela knew they had taken the first step toward healing. Charles had used his power, wealth, and religious authority to abuse their trust, but Angela refused to be his victim any longer. She vowed to rebuild their lives, to help Kayla heal from the trauma she had endured, and to never let someone like Charles control them again. In the final moments of that long, exhausting day, Angela reflected on how fragile trust could be, especially when placed in the hands of someone who wielded power so ruthlessly. She had trusted Charles because he appeared to be everything she needed, a protector, a provider, a man of faith. But beneath that facade had been a monster. Now, as Angela held Kayla's hand, she knew that they would face the future together, free from the lies and manipulation that had nearly destroyed them. The road to recovery would be long, but for the first time, they were walking it together, toward a life where they could finally be safe.
In the summer of 2014, Pastor Samuel Harris stood at the pulpit of Grace Baptist Church, his voice resonating through the packed sanctuary. Every Sunday, the congregation of Birmingham, Alabama, gathered to hear him deliver sermons filled with passion and conviction. At 45 years old, Samuel was a pillar of the community, widely respected not only for his powerful preaching, but also for his charitable work and his commitment to upholding family values. He had spent nearly 2 decades building his reputation, guiding his flock with steady leadership and a seemingly unshakable faith. To those who knew him, Samuel was the embodiment of righteousness. He had a devoted wife, Grace, who was 43, and the picture of a dutiful pastor's wife. She organized church events, volunteered in the community, and was adored by all who knew her. Together, they had 2 teenage children, David, 17, and Lily, 15, who were model students and involved in church youth groups. The Harris family seemed perfect in every way, living in a modest but comfortable home just a few miles from the church, a life steeped in religious devotion and outward harmony. But beneath the surface, Samuel carried a dark and dangerous secret. Over the years, his personal struggles with desire and temptation had grown more intense. Despite his outward appearance of moral fortitude, Samuel's inner life was fraught with conflict, particularly around his suppressed attraction to men, something that his position in the church and his role as a family man would never allow him to express publicly. It wasn't until early that year, when a new 20-year-old church member named Alex began attending services, that Samuel's carefully constructed life started to unravel. Alex was unlike anyone Samuel had encountered before, a troubled but charismatic young man who had a certain intensity about him. Samuel took notice of Alex almost immediately, feeling drawn to him in a way he couldn't fully explain. It began innocently enough. Samuel offered to mentor Alex, who had recently left a turbulent home life and sought guidance in the church. At first, their meetings were centered on prayer and counseling. Alex seemed lost, looking for purpose and direction. Samuel, with his desire to help and protect, believed he was doing the Lord's work by guiding this troubled soul. But as the months passed, their conversations grew more personal, and the bond between them deepened. Samuel found himself looking forward to their meetings with a mix of anticipation and guilt, battling the conflicting emotions stirring within him. He had never before acted on these feelings, but with Alex, the temptation became too strong to resist. Their relationship soon crossed the line into something far more intimate. It happened one night after a late church event, when they were alone in Samuel's office. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and before either of them could stop it, their relationship shifted from mentor and mentee to something far more dangerous. The affair began in secret, filled with stolen moments and hushed encounters, always cloaked in the shadow of Samuel's public life. The weight of the affair quickly bore down on Samuel. Each time he stepped up to the pulpit, he felt the crushing hypocrisy of preaching about sin and righteousness while hiding his own. His guilt was overwhelming, and yet he couldn't break away from Alex, The thrill of the secrecy and the escape from his rigid, duty-bound life pulled him deeper into the affair, even as he struggled with the knowledge that it would destroy him if it ever came to light. Alex, for his part, was aware of the power he held over Samuel. Though he was initially drawn to the pastor's wisdom and stability, their relationship gave him a sense of control over the man who seemed so unshakable in front of the congregation. Alex's troubled past made him crave attention and affection, and Samuel's forbidden desire provided exactly that. As their affair grew, Alex began to push for more time, more intimacy, and eventually more acknowledgement. While Samuel was tangled in his clandestine affair, his wife Grace remained unaware. She had long admired her husband's dedication to the church, even if his recent distance troubled her. She assumed his increasing absences were due to his busy schedule and the growing demands of the congregation. Grace herself was often consumed by her own responsibilities, planning church functions, leading Bible study groups, and tending to their home. Her trust in Samuel was absolute, her belief in his integrity unshakable. To the outside world, the Harris family appeared flawless, the epitome of a God-fearing, morally upright household. But beneath the surface, the cracks were already forming. Samuel's double life was unsustainable, and the secret he shared with Alex threatened to implode everything he had worked so hard to protect. The affair, dangerous from the start, was a ticking time bomb. Samuel's inability to reconcile his private desires with his public image was pushing him closer to the edge. The tension between his role as pastor, father, and husband, and the man he had become in secret, was slowly suffocating him. He knew that if anyone discovered the truth, the fallout would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for his entire family and the church he had spent his life building. As the weeks went on, the weight of the secret grew heavier, and Samuel found himself trapped between the expectations of his congregation, the demands of his family, and his growing dependence on Alex. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. As the weeks passed, the forbidden affair between Pastor Samuel Harris and Alex grew more intense, dragging both men deeper into a dangerous web of secrecy and sin. It had started innocently enough. Samuel had taken Alex under his wing, offering him guidance and spiritual support. Alex, at just 20 years old, had been struggling with his identity, feeling lost in a world that didn't seem to accept him. Samuel, with his position of authority and wisdom, seemed like the perfect person to offer him solace. But their meetings, which began in the pastor's office, quickly became something more. At first, it was the stolen glances, the accidental brush of hands, and the moments when their conversations drifted away from faith and into personal confessions. Samuel felt an attraction to Alex that he couldn't explain, an attraction that stirred something within him that he had long buried. He knew it was wrong. He knew that if anyone in the congregation found out, it would ruin his career, his family, and his faith. Yet he couldn't stop himself. Alex, who had grown up in a broken home and had never known true affection, was drawn to Samuel in ways that went beyond mentorship. He saw in Samuel not just a father figure, but someone who accepted him in a way no one else had. Their affair offered Alex a sense of belonging, of being seen, and he clung to Samuel's attention as if it were the only thing holding him together. They both knew the risks. Every time they met, they were playing with fire. At first, their encounters were cautious, stolen moments in the church when no one was around. They met in the sanctuary after evening services, under the guise of late-night prayer sessions. Samuel would lock the doors, and in the dim light of the church, the lines between mentor and lover blurred. Each time they were together, Samuel's guilt gnawed at him. He would return home to Grace and their children, feeling the weight of his betrayal. As the affair deepened, their rendezvous grew more reckless. Alex began to push for more time with Samuel, craving the intimacy and connection they shared. It wasn't long before they started meeting outside the church. They would drive to motels far from Birmingham, where they could be together without fear of being caught. The anonymity of the motels offered them a temporary reprieve from their double lives. Samuel, caught between his faith and his desires, would leave these meetings filled with guilt and shame, but always return to Alex when the temptation grew too strong. The affair began to take a toll on Samuel's personal and professional life. His sermons, once filled with passion and conviction, became flat and uninspired. He often found himself distracted, his mind wandering back to his secret life with Alex. The congregation noticed the change, whispering among themselves about how the pastor seemed distant, how his energy had waned. Samuel's colleagues in the ministry began to question whether he was struggling with burnout or something more serious. At home, the tension between Samuel and Grace was growing. Grace, ever the supportive wife, couldn't help but notice how withdrawn her husband had become. He spent more time away from home, often claiming to be attending church meetings or counseling sessions late into the night. When he was home, he was distant, emotionally unavailable. Grace tried to reach out to him, asking if he was stressed from the demands of the church, but Samuel brushed her off, offering vague reassurances. Grace's suspicions grew. She knew her husband well, and something about his behavior felt different, more secretive. He was guarding his phone more closely, and there were nights when he didn't come home until after midnight. Though Grace tried to push the thoughts aside, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something he wasn't telling her. For Samuel, the dual life he was living was becoming unbearable. He spent his days preaching about morality and faith, urging his congregation to walk the righteous path, while he himself was sinking deeper into sin. The guilt was suffocating. Each time he stood at the pulpit, delivering sermons about the dangers of temptation and the importance of family, he felt like a fraud. He would look out into the faces of his congregation, people who trusted him, looked up to him, and feel a deep sense of shame. He feared the day when his secret would be revealed, when everything he had built would come crashing down. And yet, he couldn't stop. The affair had become an addiction, something that pulled him in, no matter how hard he tried to resist. He would tell himself that each time was the last, that he would end things with Alex and return to his family and his faith. But the moment he saw Alex again, all those resolutions crumbled. The pull was too strong. Alex, meanwhile, was becoming more attached. He began to depend on Samuel, not just for the physical intimacy they shared, but for emotional support. Samuel was the only person who seemed to understand him, the only one who made him feel wanted. As their affair continued, Alex grew bolder, wanting more from Samuel. More time, more attention, more commitment. He was no longer satisfied with the brief moments they could steal together. He wanted Samuel to choose him over his family, over his church. But Samuel knew that was impossible. He had built his entire life on his role as a pastor, a husband, a father. To leave it all behind for Alex would mean destroying everything and everyone he cared about. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him, but it didn't stop the affair. It only made the stakes higher. The relationship between Samuel and Alex was a ticking time bomb. The secrecy, the guilt, and the growing emotional strain were pushing Samuel closer to the edge. He knew that if anyone found out, the consequences would be catastrophic. But as much as he tried to distance himself, the forbidden nature of their affair only fueled his desire. As the weeks turned into months, the weight of Samuel's secret affair with Alex began to erode his once carefully maintained life. The guilt gnawed at him day and night, and with it came a growing paranoia. Every glance from a church member felt like judgment. Every conversation felt like an interrogation. He feared that someone, anyone, could discover the truth, and the thought of his world crumbling was unbearable. At home, Samuel's demeanor had changed drastically. He was no longer the patient and loving husband Grace had known for years. Instead, he had become irritable, quick to anger over minor things. Simple conversations would spiral into arguments, and their children, sensing the tension, began to avoid him. Samuel would often stay out late, claiming it was for church business or counseling sessions, but Grace couldn't ignore the shift in his behavior. The warmth and attentiveness he had once shown her were now replaced with distance and coldness. Grace initially attributed his change to stress. The demands of leading a congregation were heavy, and she knew Samuel took his role seriously. She thought perhaps he was dealing with the emotional burdens of counseling troubled church members, or maybe he was just burnt out. But as time went on, her suspicions began to grow. Samuel had become secretive, guarding his phone and frequently disappearing for hours without explanation. Grace noticed the exhaustion in his face, the nervous way he checked his surroundings, and the lack of genuine connection between them. Meanwhile, in private, Samuel's guilt was overwhelming. He hated what he had become, a man who preached about righteousness and family values, but secretly betrayed those same principles. Each time he stood in front of the congregation, delivering sermons about faith and morality, he felt like a hypocrite. His words felt hollow, and his once passionate sermons were now filled with half-hearted conviction. He could see the confusion in the eyes of his congregation. They were used to a pastor who spoke with fire and confidence, but now Samuel seemed distant, distracted, and lacking his former zeal. Church members whispered among themselves, wondering what had changed in their beloved leader. At night, alone with his thoughts, Samuel's mind raced. He couldn't escape the fear of exposure. What if someone had seen him with Alex? What if Alex told someone? The idea that his secret could come to light consumed him. He became hyper-vigilant, constantly looking over his shoulder, second-guessing every interaction. His paranoia grew to the point where he avoided spending time with his closest colleagues, fearing they might somehow sense what he had done. Even at home, he kept Grace at arm's length, afraid that she would notice the cracks in his facade. But as Samuel tried to distance himself from the affair, Alex became more demanding. At first, their relationship had been thrilling for both of them, an escape from their realities. But for Alex, it had evolved into something more. He was no longer content with stolen moments in secret. He wanted a real relationship with Samuel. He began to pressure Samuel, suggesting that he should leave Grace and start a new life with him. Alex was young and impulsive, and the thought of Samuel choosing his family over him enraged him. The more Samuel resisted, the more reckless Alex became. He began calling Samuel at all hours, leaving him anxious and constantly on edge. Alex didn't seem to care about the risks, pushing Samuel to meet him in more public places, daring him to act like they were together. Samuel, already drowning in fear, grew even more terrified that their affair would be discovered. He knew that if anyone found out, it wouldn't just ruin his reputation. It would destroy everything he had built, from his marriage to his career in the church. Grace, still unaware of the affair, began to piece together that something was terribly wrong. Samuel had always been open with her, sharing the details of his day and the struggles of his ministry. But now he was closed off, secretive, and quick to deflect any questions she asked. She started to wonder if there was someone else in his life, though she couldn't imagine her husband, a man of faith, being unfaithful. The thought crossed her mind that Samuel might be hiding a deeper problem. Perhaps he was dealing with personal demons she didn't understand. One evening, after yet another late-night absence, Grace confronted Samuel. She tried to ask him if something was wrong, but Samuel, panicked and on edge, lashed out. He accused her of being too controlling, of not trusting him, and stormed out of the house. Grace was left standing in the kitchen, stunned and hurt, realizing that whatever was happening with her husband was far more serious than she had thought. At the same time, Alex's frustration reached a boiling point. He had begun to feel used, like he was nothing more than a dirty secret for Samuel to hide. He wanted more time, more attention, and most of all, more commitment. He wasn't willing to stay in the shadows any longer, and he started to demand that Samuel make a choice. Either leave his family and be with him, or end the affair for good. Samuel was caught in a nightmare of his own making. He knew that leaving Grace would destroy his family, but ending things with Alex seemed impossible. The young man had become a significant part of his life, and Samuel couldn't imagine walking away, even though he knew continuing the affair would lead to disaster. With every passing day, the walls closed in on him, and the guilt became unbearable. He felt trapped in a web of lies, unable to find a way out without losing everything. The tension in Samuel's life had reached its peak. His family, his faith, his career, all were hanging by a thread, and the choices he made in the coming weeks would determine whether he could keep it all together or watch everything fall apart. As Samuel's affair with Alex continued, the cracks in his marriage to Grace grew more apparent. Grace, once trusting and devoted, began noticing Samuel's erratic behavior. He would often leave the house late at night, claiming he had urgent church matters to attend to, but his excuses seemed flimsy. His phone, once left unattended and unlocked, was now constantly by his side, locked with a password Grace didn't know. Samuel had never been secretive before, but now he was evasive, deflecting questions or responding with vague explanations. It wasn't just his absences that were suspicious. His sermons had become dull, lacking the conviction they once carried, and he seemed perpetually distracted, even during family moments. Grace's intuition told her that something was wrong, but she didn't want to believe it. She had always seen Samuel as a man of unwavering faith, someone who dedicated his life to God and his family. She pushed her suspicions aside for as long as she could, convincing herself that the stress of managing the congregation was taking a toll on him. But with each passing week, the unease in the pit of her stomach grew stronger. Samuel, on the other hand, was becoming more reckless. The thrill of his affair with Alex had clouded his judgment, and he began meeting him in riskier places, motels just outside the city, and even isolated corners of the church. He justified these meetings as necessary, telling himself that he needed these moments to keep his emotions in check, but deep down, he knew the risks were mounting. Each time he met Alex, the danger of being discovered seemed to loom larger. The pressure of hiding the affair was suffocating, and yet he couldn't bring himself to end it. One evening, Grace overheard Samuel on the phone, speaking in hushed tones to someone. He mentioned meeting later, and kept his voice low, as if he didn't want anyone to overhear. Grace's heart sank. Samuel had always been open about his calls, especially with church members, but this conversation felt different, secretive and personal. She didn't confront him immediately, still unsure of what exactly was going on, but a seed of doubt had been planted. In the days that followed, Grace grew more observant. She started paying closer attention to Samuel's routine, noticing how he would check his phone constantly, his demeanor becoming more anxious. He was growing distant, not just emotionally, but physically, spending less time at home and more time locked away in his office or out of the house altogether. Grace felt isolated, as though she was watching her husband slip away from her, and she didn't know how to stop it. The breaking point came when Grace found herself alone one afternoon. Samuel had left for yet another emergency meeting, and Grace decided to check his phone, which he had left behind in his rush to leave. To her surprise, it wasn't locked. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through his messages, not sure what she was looking for, but knowing deep down that something wasn't right. What she found shattered her. There, in the hidden corner of his messaging app, were conversations between Samuel and Alex. The messages were explicit, revealing a side of her husband she had never known, a side that horrified her. It wasn't just the affair itself that devastated her, but the fact that it was with Alex, a young man from their own congregation. Grace's mind raced as she pieced together the moments she had missed, the late nights, the strange behavior, and the lies Samuel had told her. It all made sense now. Grace sat in stunned silence, her world unraveling before her eyes. The man she thought she knew, the man who had stood by her side for years preaching faith and morality, had betrayed her in the most unimaginable way. The affair wasn't just a breach of their marriage, it was a violation of everything their life together stood for. She couldn't believe how deeply her life had been intertwined with this lie, how Samuel had maintained his pastoral role while living a double life. All the while she had supported him, encouraged him, and believed in him, only to find that his faith was nothing but a mask. In the days that followed her discovery, Grace wrestled with the overwhelming emotions of betrayal, anger, and humiliation. She couldn't bring herself to confront Samuel immediately, fearing that the confrontation might tear their family apart. But she also knew she couldn't ignore the truth. Every interaction with Samuel became painful, her knowledge of his affair tainting everything he said and did. She avoided looking him in the eye, unable to mask the bitterness and hurt she felt. Samuel, oblivious to Grace's discovery, continued his charade. His meetings with Alex had grown increasingly tense, with Alex pushing for more commitment and threatening to expose their relationship if Samuel didn't make a choice. But Samuel was paralyzed by fear. Fear of losing his family, fear of losing his position in the church, and fear of the shame that would come with the truth. Yet he couldn't bring himself to cut ties with Alex either. His life was spiraling out of control, and with each passing day, the walls were closing in tighter around him. Grace, now knowing the truth, began quietly preparing for the inevitable confrontation. She started keeping her own records, saving the messages, documenting Samuel's absences, and even confiding in a close friend about what she had discovered. She didn't know what her next steps would be, But she knew that she couldn't continue living in this lie. The trust between her and Samuel was gone, replaced by a cold anger that simmered beneath the surface of every interaction. The cracks in their marriage were now deep and irreparable. What had once been a union built on love and faith was now crumbling under the weight of deceit and betrayal. The question was no longer if their life together would collapse, but when. The confrontation between Grace and Samuel took place on a tense evening in late fall. Grace had spent the past few days in silent turmoil, quietly collecting her emotions. But when Samuel came home late one night, she couldn't contain it any longer. The weight of betrayal was suffocating, and she knew that pretending everything was normal was no longer an option. The moment Samuel stepped through the door, Grace's anger, hurt, and disbelief boiled over. Samuel, sensing that something was wrong, immediately became defensive. His life had been spiraling out of control for weeks, and the constant pressure of hiding his affair with Alex had left him paranoid and on edge. As he walked into the house, the tension was palpable, and when he saw the look in Grace's eyes, he knew that the truth had finally caught up to him. Without hesitation, Grace confronted him, laying out the messages she had found. The evidence was undeniable. There was no escaping it now. Samuel's initial reaction was to downplay the affair, to try and salvage what little control he had left. He described it as a moment of weakness, something that had spiraled beyond his control, but had never meant to harm anyone. But as Grace hurled accusation after accusation at him, he realized that there was no way to mitigate the damage. The conversation quickly escalated into a shouting match. Grace's voice trembled with emotion as she recounted the years she had spent standing by Samuel's side, supporting him as he built his reputation as a respected pastor. Her anger turned into grief as she spoke of the hypocrisy of his actions, knowing that the man who had once preached about morality had been lying to her for months, if not years. She had sacrificed everything for their family and for his career, and now she saw it all crumbling because of his selfishness. Samuel, guilt-ridden and ashamed, tried to explain his side, but his words only fanned the flames. He admitted to the affair, but attempted to justify it as a fleeting mistake, blaming the pressures of his position and the emotional void he had been feeling. But Grace saw right through his excuses. She had been faithful, loving, and supportive. There was no justification for what he had done. Samuel had not only betrayed her as a wife, but he had also betrayed his role as a father, a pastor, and a man of faith. Grace's anger turned to cold fury as she made a declaration that sent a chill down Samuel's spine. She threatened to expose him to the church, to reveal the truth about his affair with Alex to the congregation. Samuel had spent years building his reputation as a moral leader in the community, and the thought of losing everything, his career, his respect, and his livelihood, terrified him. The church had always been his sanctuary, the place where he held power and authority. Without it, he was nothing. Samuel, realizing the gravity of the situation, pleaded with Grace to reconsider. He promised to end the affair, to go to counseling, to do whatever it took to fix the damage he had caused. But Grace wasn't interested in his apologies. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too raw. She had already lost her trust in him, and no amount of promises could repair that. For Grace, the marriage was already over. Meanwhile, Alex, sensing that things were unraveling, had grown desperate. The affair had given him a sense of power and validation, and the idea of losing Samuel, his lover and mentor, was unbearable. He began pressuring Samuel to make a choice, either leave Grace and the church for him, or he would expose the affair himself. Alex was no longer content to remain in the shadows, and the thought of being abandoned filled him with rage. He threatened to reveal their relationship to the church, to the media, and to anyone who would listen if Samuel didn't choose him. This ultimatum pushed Samuel to the edge. He was trapped between two worlds, his marriage and his public life on one side, and his illicit relationship with Alex on the other. The weight of the secret, the guilt, and the fear of exposure were crushing him. Every path seemed to lead to ruin, and he didn't know which way to turn. As the confrontation with Grace raged on, Samuel's mind raced with fear. He realized that his life was spiraling out of control, and there was no way to stop it. The man he had once been, a devoted husband, a respected pastor, was gone, replaced by someone he barely recognized. The truth had shattered the carefully crafted image he had built, and now he was faced with the devastating consequences of his actions. The confrontation ended with Grace leaving the house, slamming the door behind her. She couldn't bear to be in the same space as Samuel any longer. The reality of what had happened left Samuel alone, standing in the ruins of his life, unsure of what to do next. He knew that the reckoning was far from over. Both Grace and Alex held the power to destroy him, and the walls were closing in. The perfect life Samuel had built, the respect he had garnered over the years, was now hanging by a thread. All it would take was one wrong move, one more slip, and everything would come crashing down. As the days passed following Grace's discovery of Samuel's affair, the tension within the Harris household reached unbearable levels. Samuel had retreated into a state of fear and desperation, knowing that his double life was on the brink of exposure. Grace, fueled by anger and hurt, had made up her mind to leave him and reveal everything to the church. She could no longer bear the hypocrisy, the lies, and the betrayal that had shattered their marriage. Samuel's reputation, built over years of preaching morality and family values, was hanging by a thread, and the threat of losing everything, his family, his position, his life, kept him paralyzed in a state of anxiety. Meanwhile, Alex was spiraling. The pressure he had placed on Samuel to leave Grace and commit to their relationship had backfired, and now he was faced with the reality that Samuel might choose his wife and his public life over him. The power he had held over Samuel, the control he had believed would secure their future together, was slipping away. Desperate and consumed by feelings of abandonment, Alex made a rash decision. One evening, Alex arrived at the Harris home unannounced. It was raining heavily, and the darkened skies reflected the storm brewing inside the house. When Samuel opened the door and saw Alex standing there, drenched and visibly distraught, he knew things were about to spiral out of control. Samuel quickly ushered Alex inside, fearing that Grace might see him and that the final blow to his carefully constructed life was imminent. But Grace wasn't the type to sit silently in the background anymore. She had already made it clear that she intended to leave, and seeing Alex in her home confirmed her worst suspicions. The situation exploded into a full-blown confrontation. Grace, her voice sharp and unwavering, told Samuel that she was filing for divorce and would be exposing his affair to the church board. She was done protecting him and the facade of their life. Her words were like a death sentence to Samuel, whose entire identity was built on his role as a pastor, a community leader, and a man of faith. In the midst of this chaos, Alex became increasingly unstable. He had followed Samuel into this tangled web of lies, believing that they would eventually be together. Now it seemed like Samuel was about to lose everything, and Alex felt he had been used, discarded for the sake of Samuel's reputation. The anger and hurt that had been building inside him reached a boiling point, and in a fit of desperation, Alex lashed out. He accused Samuel of manipulating him, of leading him on and destroying his life for nothing. The argument quickly escalated as Samuel tried to calm Alex, but his attempts only inflamed the young man's fury. The emotional and psychological strain on everyone in the room turned the situation into a powder keg waiting to explode. As voices rose, accusations flew, and emotions spiraled out of control, Alex snapped. In the heat of the moment, Alex grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter. His actions were fueled by a mix of betrayal, desperation, and fear. Samuel, caught off guard, tried to back away, but Alex, blinded by rage, lunged at him. The struggle between them was brief but violent. Grace, standing in shock, was powerless to intervene as Alex, in his desperation, fatally stabbed Samuel in the chest. The room fell into a chilling silence as Samuel collapsed to the floor, bleeding out. The realization of what had just happened hit Alex like a freight train. He stumbled backward, the knife slipping from his hand as he stared at Samuel's lifeless body on the floor. The enormity of his actions washed over him, and without thinking he fled the scene, leaving Grace frozen in horror at the sight of her husband dying in front of her. Grace, shaking with fear and disbelief, rushed to Samuel's side, but it was too late. His breathing was shallow, his pulse weak. The man she had once loved, the father of her children, was dying, and there was nothing she could do to save him. She called 911, her hands trembling as she tried to explain what had happened through her sobs. But deep down, she knew there was no coming back from this. Everything had fallen apart. When the police arrived, the full extent of the tragedy became clear. Samuel Harris, once a respected pastor and pillar of the Baptist community, was dead. His life destroyed by the secret affair that had unraveled in the most devastating way possible. The affair, the lies, the betrayal, all of it had culminated in this moment of senseless violence. Alex was arrested later that night, charged with manslaughter. He was in a state of shock, barely able to comprehend the gravity of what he had done. His life, too, had been destroyed, swept away in the tide of emotion and desperation that had driven him to take Samuel's life. Grace, left to pick up the pieces, was shattered. Not only had she lost her husband, but she now faced the humiliating task of confronting the church and community with the truth of Samuel's double life. The affair, once hidden in the shadows, was now out in the open, and the church that had been the center of their lives was at the epicenter of scandal and shame. Samuel's legacy, once rooted in respect and admiration, was forever tainted by the dark secret he had tried so hard to keep buried. The Harris family's fall from grace sent shockwaves through the community. The congregation, once united under Samuel's leadership, was now fractured, struggling to make sense of the tragedy that had unfolded in their midst. Grace, burdened with the weight of her husband's betrayal and the loss of the life they had built, was left to face the consequences alone. The tragic consequences of Samuel's actions served as a chilling reminder of the destructive power of secrets and lies, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would haunt those involved for years to come.